Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. Hell, it wasn't like any animal I knew. 20 years as a park ranger, and I'd never felt a chill run down my spine quite like this. I'm Sarah Reeves, Senior Ranger at Blackwood State Park. It's a vast wilderness area, mostly unexplored, with dense forests and rugged mountains. The kind of place where you could easily get lost and never be found. And tonight, as I stood on my cabin porch, listening to that bone-chilling sound echo across the valley, I knew something wasn't right. The call came in just before sunset. A group of hikers reported strange noises and a feeling of being watched. Nothing concrete, but enough to warrant a check. Usually, I'd wait until morning, but something in their voices, the fear, it got to me. I radioed in my plans to the station, grabbed my gear, and headed out. The fading light cast long shadows as I drove down the winding park road. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I shook off the feeling. Just my imagination getting the better of me. About 5 miles in, I parked at the trailhead. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. As I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing a narrow path disappearing into the undergrowth. I took a deep breath and started walking. The forest was alive with nighttime sounds, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the brush. But as I ventured deeper, an eerie silence fell. No crickets chirping, no leaves rustling, just the crunch of my boots on the trail and my own breathing. That's when I heard it again. The howl, closer this time, much closer. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the holster on my hip. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the air with its otherworldly resonance. It trailed off into a low, rumbling growl that I felt more than heard. My training kicked in. I swept the area with my flashlight, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. But then, just at the edge of the beam, I caught a flash of something. Eyes, reflecting the light, 2 of them, set high off the ground, too high to be a bear or a mountain lion. They blinked once, then vanished. Heart pounding, I pushed on. The trail wound deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little moonlight filtered through. My flashlight beam seemed to grow dimmer with each step, as if the darkness itself was pushing back against it. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to lose meaning in that primal landscape, but eventually the trees thinned, and I found myself on the edge of a small clearing. And there, in the center, stood an old cabin. It was a decrepit thing, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging under the weight of years. No light shone from its windows, which stared out at the forest like empty eye sockets. I approached cautiously, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, creaking softly in the night breeze. I called out, announcing myself as a park ranger. The only response was the echo of my own voice. With a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The beam of my flashlight revealed a scene of abandonment and decay. A layer of dust covered everything. An old table, a couple of broken chairs, shelves lined with rusted cans and moldy books. But it was the walls that caught my attention. They were covered in claw marks. Long, deep gouges ran from floor to ceiling, some so deep they'd splintered the wood. These weren't the marks of a bear or any other animal I knew. They were too precise, too deliberate. I ran my fingers along one of the grooves, feeling the roughness of the torn wood. Whatever had done this was powerful and big. A sound from outside snapped me back to the present. Something was moving around the cabin, heavy footsteps, crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. My pulse quickened as I realized I was trapped. The only way out was through that door, and whatever was out there was between me and safety. I switched off my flashlight, plunging the cabin into darkness. My eyes slowly adjusted, moonlight filtering in through gaps in the walls, providing just enough illumination to make out shapes. I pressed myself against the wall next to the door, listening intently. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then silence. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound. Nothing. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. Had it gone? I wasn't about to take any chances. I'd wait it out here until dawn if I had to. As I stood there, trying to control my breathing, something caught my eye. A tuft of fur caught on a splinter of wood near one of the claw marks. I reached out, plucking it free. It was coarse and thick, unlike anything I'd encountered before, and there was so much of it. Whatever this came from, it was massive. That's when I noticed the smell. A musky animal odor that seemed to seep in through the walls. It grew stronger with each passing second until it was almost overpowering. My eyes watered, and I had to fight the urge to gag. A low growl rumbled from just outside the door. Not a growl of anger or aggression, but one of curiosity, intelligence. I could feel the vibrations through the floorboards. My hand tightened on my holster, though I knew my sidearm would likely be useless against whatever was out there. The door began to move. Slowly, inch by inch, it swung open. Moonlight spilled into the cabin, and with it came a massive shadow. I held my breath, pressing myself harder against the wall, praying that whatever it was wouldn't notice me. A foot, no, a paw, stepped into view. It was enormous, easily twice the size of my hand, with long, curved claws that dug into the wooden floor. Fur-covered legs followed, thick as tree trunks. I couldn't bring myself to look up to see the rest of it. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering so loud I was sure it would hear. Hot, fetid breath washed over me. I could feel its presence, so close I could have reached out and touched it. Time seemed to stand still. Every muscle in my body tensed, ready to fight or flee, though I knew either action would be futile. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The pressure in the air lifted. The overpowering smell faded. I opened my eyes to find the doorway empty, moonlight streaming in unobstructed. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. Eventually, the first rays of dawn began to filter through the trees. Only then did I find the courage to move, to step outside and survey my surroundings. The clearing was empty, no sign of the creature, no footprints in the soft earth. If it weren't for the claw marks inside the cabin and the tuft of fur still clutched in my trembling hand, I might have convinced myself it was all a nightmare. I made my way back to my vehicle in a daze. The forest now alive with the normal sounds of morning. Birds chirped. Squirrels chattered. It was as if the events of the night had never happened. Back at the ranger station, I filed my report, stuck to the facts. Strange noises, an abandoned cabin, signs of large wildlife. I left out the parts that I couldn't explain, the things that defied logic and reason. Who would believe me anyway? But I kept the tuft of fur hidden away in my desk drawer. And at night, when the wind howls through the trees and shadows seem to move of their own accord, I find myself wondering, what really lurks in the depths of Blackwood State Park? And when will it return? Because deep down, I know the truth. Something is out there, something that shouldn't exist, and sooner or later I'll have to face it again. It's only a matter of time. Story 2. I've been a park ranger for over 15 years. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for that night. The night when everything changed. It was supposed to be a routine patrol, just like any other. I was covering a section of the park I knew like the back of my hand. A stretch of dense forest and winding trails where I'd walked countless times. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest turned dark, something shifted. You spend enough time out there, you can feel it when the woods get quiet in a way they shouldn't. That's when you know you're not alone. It all started just after sunset. I was doing my usual rounds, checking for campfires, making sure no one had wandered off the marked trails. It was late September, and the chill in the air had a bite to it. My flashlight beam cut through the trees as I walked, my breath misting in front of me in the cool evening air. For the first hour or so, everything was normal. Just me, the wind in the pines, and the occasional hoot of an owl. But then, around 9:30 p.m., I heard it, the first howl. At first, I brushed it off as a coyote, maybe a wolf, though wolves were rare in this part of the state. The howl was low, guttural, and it echoed through the trees in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I stopped walking, shining my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I continued on, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. The wind picked up, rustling the branches overhead, and for a while I thought that was it, just some animal howling in the distance. But 10 minutes later, the howl came again, closer this time, and something about it was wrong. It wasn't just a sound. It felt intentional, like it was meant to be heard, meant to get my attention. I turned up the volume on my radio, checking in with the station. The static hissed back at me, cutting off in sharp bursts, but no response. I tried again. Nothing. Great, I muttered to myself, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet woods. Maybe the terrain was blocking the signal, or maybe the batteries were low. Either way, I kept moving, but now I was on edge. My hand hovered near my sidearm, though I'd never had to use it in all my years out here. Another howl, even closer. This time, it was followed by the sound of movement, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the underbrush. "Who's out there?" I called, hoping it was just some hiker who'd gotten lost. "You need help?" No answer. Just the sound of those footsteps, now circling me. I could hear them moving from one side of the trail to the other, always just out of sight. I spun in place, flashlight sweeping through the trees, but all I could see were shadows. Thick branches swayed in the wind, their skeletal shapes twisting in the dim light. Then something moved, a dark shape, tall and fast, darting between the trees on my left. I only caught a glimpse, but it was enough. Whatever it was huge, bigger than any coyote or bear, and it was upright. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. "Show yourself!" Still no answer. The footsteps stopped, leaving the woods in an eerie silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I felt my pulse quicken, and I started walking again, faster this time. The trail led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to block out what little light was left from the fading moon. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I was plunged into darkness. I smacked it against my thigh, the beam sputtering back to life. That's when I saw them, eyes, glowing yellow eyes, reflecting back at me from between the trees. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, too wide apart, and they were watching me, tracking my every move. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and my hand went to my gun, but I didn't draw it, not yet. The eyes blinked, then disappeared into the shadows. And then came the howl, so close this time, it rattled my bones. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was deeper, more guttural, almost human, but not quite. It sent a chill down my spine. I didn't wait. I turned and started walking fast, trying to put distance between me and whatever the hell that thing was. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I'd heard the stories, whispers among the rangers, legends about creatures that roamed these woods at night. Creatures most people never saw, but a few unlucky souls had encountered. Dogman. I quickened my pace, practically jogging now. The footsteps started again, matching my speed. Whatever it was following me, staying just out of sight but close enough that I could hear its heavy breathing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, like a tree branch snapping under the weight of something massive. I whipped around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I caught another glimpse of it, this time clearer. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with broad shoulders and thick, matted fur. Its face was elongated, like a wolf's, but it stood on two legs. Its eyes glowed yellow in the beam of my flashlight, and its teeth, God, its teeth were sharp, glistening in the light. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran, my boots pounding against the dirt trail as I bolted down the path. The creature let out a snarl, and I could hear it crashing through the trees behind me, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself to keep running, the cold air burning my lungs. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The creature was right behind me. I could feel it. I could hear its growls, feel the vibrations in the ground as it pounded after me. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it, the ranger station, a small wooden building at the edge of the forest. I sprinted toward it, my legs burning with exhaustion. The creature was closing in, its snarls growing louder, its footsteps shaking the ground beneath me. I reached the door and slammed into it, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook. The sound of the creature's breath was so close now, I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. Finally, I managed to unlock the door and throw it open, diving inside and slamming it shut behind me. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, my heart racing. Outside, I could hear the creature pacing, its heavy footsteps thudding against the ground. It let out another low growl, and for a moment I thought it might break down the door. But then, slowly, the footsteps receded. The growls faded into the distance, and the forest fell silent once again. I didn't move for a long time, my back pressed against the door, listening to the quiet. When I finally mustered the courage to stand, I peered out the window, but there was nothing, no sign of the creature, no glowing eyes, just the dark, empty woods. I stayed in the station until dawn, too afraid to go back outside. When the sun finally rose, I ventured out to where I'd last seen it. The ground was torn up, branches snapped, and there, in the dirt, were footprints. Massive, clawed footprints. I never spoke about what happened that night, not to anyone. Who would believe me? But I never went back to that part of the park after dark. Something's out there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting, and I'm never going to risk running into it again. Story 3. We woke up to a wall of fog so thick it felt like the forest had swallowed us whole. The night before, everything was fine, just a typical camping trip with some friends. We'd pitched our tents, lit a fire, roasted marshmallows, and swapped a few ghost stories to pass the time. Nothing serious, just a couple of city kids out in the middle of the wilderness, enjoying a break from the daily grind. The sky had been clear when we went to bed. I remember looking up and seeing the stars scattered like glitter across the inky black sky. But that morning, it was different. Everything was different. I rolled out of my tent, yawning, and nearly tripped over Jake, who was standing frozen, staring out into the trees. "Dude, what the hell?" I mumbled, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. Jake didn't answer. He just kept staring. That's when I noticed the fog. It was everywhere, thick and dense, curling around the trees like smoke. I couldn't see more than 5 feet in front of me, and beyond that, it was just a solid wall of white. The air was damp, and it smelled earthy like wet leaves and moss, but there was something else too, something metallic, almost like blood, hanging in the air. "Where did this come from?" I asked, my voice sounding too loud in the heavy silence. Jake shrugged, finally tearing his eyes away from the fog to look at me. "I don't know. It was clear last night, right?" "Yeah," I said, suddenly uneasy. "Maybe it's just morning mist. It'll burn off once the sun gets higher," but the sun was already up, and the fog wasn't thinning. If anything, it seemed to be getting thicker, pressing in closer to our camp. The others started waking up not long after. Sarah came out of her tent, looking confused, while Rachel was still half asleep, grumbling about how cold it was. We gathered around the campfire, but no one said much. We were all looking out into the fog, straining to see something, anything, beyond the white void. The silence was oppressive, like the fog had swallowed the usual sounds of the forest along with everything else. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the sound of wind. Jake was the first to suggest going for a walk, trying to figure out what was going on. "I'm telling you, there's something weird about this," he said, his voice low. "It doesn't feel right." I couldn't disagree. It didn't feel right, but what were we supposed to do? Just sit there and wait it out? Reluctantly, we decided to stick together and head down one of the nearby trails, hoping it would lead us out of the fog. Sarah grabbed her phone to use the GPS, but of course, there was no signal this deep in the woods. We packed a few essentials: water, snacks, flashlights, then started walking. The fog closed in around us as soon as we left the clearing. The trail, usually wide and well-worn, felt suffocating. The trees loomed out of the mist like dark sentinels, their branches reaching overhead to form a canopy that blocked out what little light was trying to filter through. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the air itself was pressing down on us, slowing us. "This is crazy," Rachel muttered, her voice tight. "It's like we're walking through a cloud." "Yeah," I said, my eyes darting nervously from tree to tree. "But where's the wind? Shouldn't it be blowing this fog around or something?" Jake walked ahead of us, his shoulders tense, his head on a swivel. He kept stopping every few minutes, listening, like he thought he heard something moving in the mist. At first, I didn't hear it, but after a while, I picked up on it too. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of our own footsteps, but it was there, a low, rhythmic noise, like breathing. We stopped, all of us, standing still and listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A long, drawn-out exhale, followed by silence. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. None of us responded. We didn't need to. We'd all heard it. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was even worse, thick and oppressive, like the fog itself had swallowed the sound. We stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. After what felt like an eternity, Jake shook his head, muttering something under his breath, and we started walking again. The fog, though, seemed to have other plans. It twisted around us, disorienting, turning the forest into a maze. The trail we'd been following vanished beneath our feet, swallowed by the white void. We were lost, and none of us wanted to admit it. Jake was the first to crack. "We've been walking for over an hour," he snapped, his voice tense. "We should have hit something by now. Another trail, a clearing, something." "We should turn back," Sarah suggested. "Go back to camp." Maybe we missed a turn, but the truth was, I didn't even know which way camp was anymore. Every tree looked the same, their dark forms fading in and out of the fog. We could have been walking in circles for all I knew. We stopped to catch our breath, and that's when the noise started again. It wasn't breathing this time. It was something else, something worse. A faint, distant cry, high-pitched and echoing through the mist. It sounded human, like someone was calling for help, but there was something off about it. The way the sound bounced around us, it was impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Did you hear that?" Rachel whispered, her face pale. "I don't like this," Jake muttered, looking around nervously. "I don't like this at all." The cry came again, louder this time and closer. It was unmistakably human now, though faint, as if carried on the wind. Except there was no wind. The air was still, thick with the damp smell of earth and fog. And then the voice said a name. My name. My blood turned to ice. The others must have heard it in too, because they all looked at me with the same wide-eyed fear. It wasn't just some random sound. It was my name. "Maybe someone's messing with us," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I didn't believe it, and neither did they. The cry came again, calling my name, dragging it out in a slow, sing-song tone that sent shivers down my spine. This time I could hear it clearly, like it was just beyond the next tree. Against my better judgment, I took a step toward the sound, shining my flashlight into the fog. "Don't," Sarah hissed, grabbing my arm. "We should go back. Now." I nodded, but I couldn't stop myself from listening, from wondering who or what was out there, calling my name. I turned back to the group, ready to suggest we head back to camp, when Rachel screamed. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. She was standing a few feet away from us, her flashlight pointed at something in the trees. I followed her gaze, and that's when I saw it. A figure, tall, gaunt, and impossibly thin, was standing just at the edge of the fog, its pale, skeletal face peeking out from behind a tree. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and its mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. It was watching us. For a moment, none of us moved. We just stood there, frozen, staring at the figure in the fog. It didn't move either, just stood there, grinning at us with those glowing eyes. Then, as if in slow motion, it stepped forward. The thing was tall, too tall, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, its skin pale and stretched tight over its bones. It looked almost human, but there was something wrong about it. Something that made my stomach churn and my blood run cold. It opened its mouth and the same eerie sing-song voice came out, calling my name again. That was all it took. We ran. We didn't care about direction anymore. We just ran, crashing through the trees, stumbling over roots and rocks, desperate to get away from that thing. The fog closed in around us, thick and suffocating, but we didn't stop. The only thing we could hear was our own panicked breathing and the pounding of our feet against the forest floor. The thing didn't follow us, at least not that I could see, but the fog seemed to chase us, clinging to our skin, filling our lungs with damp air. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes, hours, it all blurred together. Eventually we stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. When I looked around, I realized we were back at the campsite. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We packed up in silence, our hands shaking, and left the woods as fast as we could. None of us ever went back, and none of us ever talked about what we saw in that fog. Story 4. I wasn't supposed to be out there that late. I knew better. The forest changes at night. The trees, the trails, they're familiar during the day, comforting even. But once the sun dips below the horizon, everything warps, and it's like you're stepping into a different world. But I was tired, and I'd hiked farther than I planned. So when I stumbled upon that old, abandoned cabin, it felt like a sign, shelter for the night. I could wait out the dark and head back in the morning. I should have kept walking. The cabin was small and looked ancient, like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. The wooden beams were grey and weathered, some barely holding on to the roof. It didn't look sturdy, but it was enough to keep the chill off, and at that point I wasn't picky. The trail had gotten narrow and harder to follow in the fading light. When I saw the place, I figured it was better than risking a broken leg stumbling around in the dark. I pushed open the door with a loud creak, half expecting the whole thing to fall apart as I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Damp wood, mildew, and something else, something sour, but I brushed it off. Old places like that always smelled a little off, and I wasn't about to turn back now. Inside, there was hardly anything. A table, a couple of rickety chairs, and an old rotting mattress in the corner. The air was thick, and dust swirled in my flashlight beam. I set my pack down near the door and collapsed onto the mattress, kicking off my boots with a sigh. My whole body was aching from the hike, and despite the creeping unease that settled over me as soon as I stepped into the cabin, exhaustion took over. I figured I'd sleep for a few hours, then head back at first light. The sooner I was out of there, the better. That's when I heard it. A low, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. It came from somewhere in the back of the cabin, where the shadows were thickest. I bolted upright, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to see through the darkness. I flicked my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing. Just the same old broken-down cabin, a breeze, maybe, a branch against the side of the building. I didn't know, but I didn't want to sit there and think about it too long. I lay back down, trying to convince myself I was being paranoid. But then I heard it again. This time it was closer. Something was inside the cabin with me. I held my breath, my heart racing, and listened. The sound came again, slower now, deliberate. It wasn't a breeze. It wasn't a branch. It was something or someone moving, scraping along the wooden floor. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it in every corner of the room. Nothing, no movement, no signs of life, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent. I sat up, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. The door was still closed. I would have heard it open. So, whatever it was, it had been there with me the whole time. My hand drifted toward my pack, where I had a small camping knife stashed, and I gripped it tight, feeling its cold handle against my sweaty palm. "Who's there?" I called out, though my voice didn't carry the confidence I hoped it would. No answer. The scraping stopped suddenly, replaced by silence so thick it felt suffocating. I held the knife tighter, listening, waiting for anything. A voice, a breath, a movement. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I got up slowly, the old mattress creaking beneath me. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, my flashlight sweeping the room again. The beam passed over the door, the table, and finally to the far wall. And that's when I saw them, marks, deep, jagged claw marks gouged into the wood near the base of the wall. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. They were fresh, too fresh. Suddenly there was a thud, a heavy, deliberate thud, right outside the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of something dragging across the dirt. My stomach twisted in knots as I backed away from the door, gripping the knife tighter. It was getting closer. Whatever was outside was right there, just on the other side of the thin wooden wall, and it was massive. I heard it breathing then, slow and heavy, like something enormous was sniffing around the cabin. My flashlight trembled in my hand as I turned it toward the window. There wasn't much glass left in the old pane, just shards clinging to the frame, but the view outside was clear. I wish I hadn't looked. At first, it was just a dark shape, hunched over, moving through the fog that had settled in around the cabin. But then it stepped closer, into the dim moonlight, and I could see it. It was tall, at least 7 feet, covered in thick, matted fur, its hunched back almost brushing the edge of the roof. It moved on 2 legs, but its arms were long, too long, its hands hanging low with claws that scraped the ground as it walked. Its face, I don't even know how to describe it. It was part human, part beast, with a long, wolf-like snout and yellow glowing eyes that scanned the cabin with a terrifying intelligence. Its lips curled back to reveal sharp, jagged teeth, and it sniffed the air, letting out a low growl that rattled the walls. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to be as quiet as possible. My mind raced. What the hell was that thing? A bear? No, not a bear. Bears didn't look like that, didn't move like that. This was something else, something I'd only heard about in campfire stories and late-night rumors from other hikers. A dogman. The creature moved around the cabin, its claws raking against the wooden walls as it circled. I could hear it huffing, its breath heavy and labored as it stopped near the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. Then with a loud thud, it slammed against the door, rattling the old wooden frame. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The door creaked, the old wood straining under the force of the impact, but it held, barely. I crouched down, trying to make myself as small as possible, praying that it wouldn't find a way inside. But the dogman wasn't giving up. It slammed against the door again, harder this time, and I could hear the wood splintering. One more hit, and it would be through. My mind was racing, desperately searching for an escape. There was no back door, no other way out. I was trapped. The dogman let out a low growl, its yellow eyes peering through the crack in the door. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My whole body was frozen in place as it sniffed the air again, its massive claws scratching at the door. Then, with a final crash, the door gave way. It stood there in the doorway, towering over me, its eyes glowing in the darkness. The smell of damp fur and rot filled the cabin as it stepped inside, its long claws dragging against the floorboards. I pressed myself against the far wall, knife still clenched in my shaking hand, but I knew it was useless. This thing was far bigger and stronger than anything I'd ever faced. There was no fighting it, no escaping it. The dogman sniffed the air again. Its eyes locked on me, its lips curled back in a snarl, exposing those sharp, jagged teeth, and then it lunged. Everything after that is a blur. I remember running, ducking past its outstretched claws, bolting through the doorway into the dark forest beyond. The fog swallowed me up as I sprinted through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. I could hear it crashing through the forest behind me, its heavy footsteps pounding the earth, getting closer and closer. I didn't stop running, not until the sun started to rise and the sounds of the creature faded into the distance. By then, I had no idea where I was, lost in the woods, exhausted, bleeding, but alive. Eventually, I found my way back to the main trail, where a search party had been sent out to look for me. I never told them the full story. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll never forget those yellow eyes watching me from the darkness, waiting. I haven't been back to that part of the woods since. Story 5. The first sign that something was terribly wrong was the silence. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, not even the whisper of wind through the trees. Just an oppressive, unnatural quiet that settled over our campsite like a heavy blanket. I've been camping in these woods for years, but I'd never experienced anything like this. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. My name's Mike, and I'm here with my buddies Tom and Chris. We've been doing these backcountry camping trips for years, always pushing ourselves to explore deeper into the wilderness. This time, we'd hiked for 2 days to reach a secluded valley that wasn't even on most maps. It was supposed to be the adventure of a lifetime. Instead, it turned into a nightmare. We'd gone to sleep with the usual sounds of the forest all around us. But when I unzipped the tent at dawn, I stepped out into a world that felt fundamentally wrong. The others must have sensed it too, because they were up and out of their tents moments later, eyes wide and darting around nervously. "Guys," Chris said, his voice barely above a whisper, "something's not right." That's when we saw it. Our food cache, suspended high in a tree to keep it safe from bears, had been completely destroyed. The thick rope was snapped like it was nothing more than thread, and the bear-proof container lay on the ground, torn open like a tin can. Its contents were strewn across the forest floor, mangled beyond recognition. "What the hell could do that?" Tom asked, his face pale in the early morning light. I shook my head, at a loss for words. Whatever had done this was strong, unnaturally strong, and big. The tree we'd used was at least 15 feet high, and the branches showed signs of being broken by something heavy. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, Chris suddenly grabbed my arm. "Look!" he hissed, pointing to the ground around our campsite. At first I didn't see what he was getting at, but then it hit me. Tracks, massive, unmistakably bipedal tracks, circled our entire campsite. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear imprints of toes and a shape that was disturbingly human-like. "We need to get out of here," Tom said, his voice shaking. "Now." I couldn't agree more. We hastily packed up our gear, leaving behind anything that wasn't absolutely essential. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow cast by the trees seemed to hide some lurking menace. As we shouldered our packs and prepared to leave, Chris pulled out the map. "If we push hard, we can make it back to the trailhead by nightfall," he said, tracing the route with his finger. I nodded, trying to ignore the knot of fear in my stomach. "Let's move." We set off at a brisk pace, the unnatural silence of the forest spurring us on. I took the lead, with Chris in the middle and Tom bringing up the rear. The trail was rough, winding through dense underbrush and over rocky outcroppings. Under normal circumstances, We would have taken our time, enjoying the rugged beauty of the landscape, but there was nothing normal about this situation. About an hour into our hike, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tracks we'd seen at the campsite were here too, paralleling our trail through the woods. Whatever had destroyed our food cache was following us. I called a quick halt, gesturing for the others to gather close. "We're being stalked," I whispered, pointing out the tracks. Chris's face went ashen. "What do we do?" I took a deep breath, trying to think rationally. "We keep moving. Pick up the pace. Whatever this thing is, we can't let it catch us out here." We pressed on, our earlier brisk pace now a near jog. The terrain became more challenging, the trail climbing steeply up a ridge. Sweat poured down my face, my lungs burning with exertion. But fear kept us moving, the knowledge that something was out there, something that shouldn't exist, driving us forward. As we crested the ridge, a sound split the air that stopped us in our tracks. It was a howl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It started low, almost subsonic, before rising to a pitch that set my teeth on edge. It was primal, full of hunger and rage, and it was close, too close. "Run!" I yelled, all pretense of stealth forgotten. We took off down the other side of the ridge, no longer following the trail, just crashing through the underbrush in a desperate bid to put distance between us and whatever was making that sound. Branches whipped at my face, roots threatened to trip me with every step. But I didn't slow down. I could hear Tom and Chris behind me, their ragged breathing and the crunch of their footsteps spurring me on. The howl came again, louder this time. It was gaining on us. We burst out of the tree line into a small clearing, momentarily blinded by the sudden sunlight. As my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my heart sink. The clearing ended in a sheer cliff face, easily 100 feet high. We were trapped. "What now?" Tom gasped, doubling over as he tried to catch his breath. I spun around, scanning the tree line we'd just emerged from. The forest had gone quiet again, that unnatural silence settling over us like a shroud. But I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. "We need to find a way up that cliff," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's our only chance." We approached the rock face, searching for any kind of handhold or route up. It was steep, with few obvious places to grip, but it was our only option. We had just started to climb when a deafening roar erupted from the forest behind us. I looked back, and in that moment, I saw it. A massive figure, easily 8 feet tall, emerged from the shadows of the trees. It was covered in thick, matted fur, with long arms that nearly reached the ground, but it was the face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a twisted parody of a human face, with a protruding snout full of sharp teeth and eyes that gleamed with an unsettling intelligence. "Climb!" I screamed, my voice cracking with terror. We scrambled up the cliff face, fear giving us strength and agility we didn't know we possessed. I could hear it below us, grunting and snarling as it started to climb after us. The rock face shook with the impact of its powerful limbs. My fingers bled as I clawed for every handhold, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't dare look down. I could hear its labored breathing getting closer, punctuated by occasional roars of frustration. Just as I thought my strength would give out, my hand found the top of the cliff. With a final surge of adrenaline, I pulled myself up and over. I turned immediately to help Tom, who was right behind me. Together, we reached down and grabbed Chris's arms, hauling him up just as a massive, fur-covered hand swiped at his legs. We collapsed on the ground, chests heaving as we gasped for air. The creature below us roared in anger, the sound echoing off the cliff face. I crawled to the edge and peered over. It was still there, about halfway up, its powerful arms straining as it tried to find a way to continue its climb. But the upper part of the cliff was smoother, offering fewer handholds. As we watched, it slipped, sliding back down several feet before catching itself. It looked up at us, and I swear I saw something like frustration in its eerily human-like eyes. With a final, ear-splitting howl, it let go, dropping back down to the forest floor. It paced back and forth at the base of the cliff for a few moments, glaring up at us. Then, with one last roar of defiance, it turned and loped back into the forest, quickly disappearing among the trees. We lay there for what felt like hours, too exhausted and terrified to move. Eventually, the normal sounds of the forest returned, birds singing, insects buzzing. It was as if a spell had been broken. What was that thing?" Chris finally asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, still struggling to process what we'd seen. "I don't know. Bigfoot? Sasquatch? Whatever it was, it shouldn't exist." We made our way back to civilization in a daze, our minds still reeling from the encounter. We reported what happened to the park rangers, but I could see the disbelief in their eyes. They searched the area, but found nothing conclusive, just some large, unidentifiable tracks and our destroyed campsite. It's been months since that day, but I still wake up in a cold sweat some nights, the memory of that creature's roar echoing in my mind. I know what I saw, what we all saw, and I know it's still out there, somewhere in the depths of the wilderness, waiting. I haven't been camping since that trip, but sometimes when I look out at the forest from the safety of my back porch, I can't help but wonder, how many other secrets are hiding out there just beyond the tree line, and how long before they decide to reveal themselves to the world? Story 6. The moment I saw those eyes on my computer screen, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. Glowing, predatory, and unmistakably intelligent, they stared back at me from the darkness of the forest. But it wasn't just the eyes that sent a chill down my spine. It was the teeth. Row upon row of razor-sharp fangs, clearly visible in the infrared image. Whatever I'd captured on my trail cam, it wasn't supposed to exist. And now, I had a sinking feeling it knew exactly where to find me. My name's Alex Brennan, and I'm a wildlife photographer specializing in cryptozoology. For years, I've been chasing legends: Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, Chupacabra, you name it. I've never really believed in any of it, but the mystery, the thrill of the hunt, that's what's always drawn me in. At least, that's what I told myself. Until tonight. It all started 3 weeks ago when I got a tip about increased Bigfoot activity in the Cascade Mountains. Normally, I'd take such reports with a grain of salt, but the source was solid, a veteran park ranger I'd worked with before. He wasn't prone to flights of fancy, so when he told me about the strange tracks and eerie howls echoing through the valleys, I knew I had to check it out. I set up my base camp in an old Forest Service cabin, miles from the nearest town. It was perfect, isolated, with easy access to the areas where the sightings had occurred. I spent the first week scouting locations, looking for signs of large, unidentified animals. I found a few interesting prints and some inexplicable claw marks on trees, but nothing conclusive. That's when I decided to set up my camera traps. High-tech trail cams equipped with motion sensors, night vision and satellite uplink to send images directly to my laptop. I placed them strategically throughout a 5-mile radius, covering game trails, water sources, and areas with the most reported activity. For days, nothing. Just the usual parade of deer, elk, and the occasional black bear. I was starting to think this was going to be another dead end. But then, 3 nights ago, everything changed. I was reviewing the day's footage when a new alert popped up on my screen. One of the cameras had been triggered just minutes ago, heart racing with anticipation. I clicked on the notification. The image that loaded onto my screen defied explanation. It was just a blur at first, a vague shape moving at incredible speed. But as I enhanced and stabilized the image, details began to emerge. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, matted fur. Its limbs were long and powerful, ending in hands. Yes, hands, not paws, with wicked-looking claws. But it was the face that truly terrified me, caught in mid-snarl. It was a nightmarish fusion of wolf and man. The elongated snout was filled with teeth that would put a great white shark to shame. And the eyes... God, Those eyes, they glowed with an unnatural intelligence, seeming to stare right through the camera. I sat there, staring at my screen in disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a man in a costume, something. But deep down, I knew. This was the real deal. I'd finally found what I'd been searching for all these years. And I was terrified. My first instinct was to pack up and get the hell out of there. But the journalist in me, the part that had driven me to chase these stories for so long, wouldn't let me leave. Not without proof. I needed to get that camera to secure the footage. It would change everything. I spent the next day preparing. I checked and rechecked my gear, loaded my backpack with supplies, and made sure my satellite phone was fully charged. As the sun began to set, I set out into the darkening forest. The hike to the camera location was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. The forest felt different at night, alive in a way I'd never experienced before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the camera. My hands shook as I removed the memory card, quickly replacing it with a fresh one. I tucked the card securely in my pocket, relief washing over me. I had it. Whatever that thing was, I had proof of its existence. That's when I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, I turned, scanning the darkness around me. Nothing, just shadows and trees. But I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. I started back towards the cabin, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, trying to snag my clothes and slow me down. The growl came again, closer this time, much closer. I broke into a run, all pretense of stealth forgotten. I could hear it now, crashing through the underbrush behind me. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time. This was a game to it. Somehow, I made it back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, fumbling with the locks. For a moment, there was silence. Then a heavy thud against the door made me stumble backward. Another impact, and the wood began to splinter. In a panic, I retreated to my workspace, frantically pulling the memory card from my pocket and inserting it into my laptop. If I was going to die here, at least the world would know what happened. The footage began to load as another crash echoed through the cabin, and that's when I saw it. The eyes, the teeth, no longer just an image on my screen, but right there, in my doorway. The creature filled the entire frame, its massive body hunched to fit through the entrance. This close, I could smell its musky animal odor, could see the saliva dripping from its fangs. It took a step forward, its claws clicking on the wooden floor. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think. This was it. This was how it ended. But then, inexplicably, it stopped. Its nostrils flared, sniffing the air. Those terrifying eyes locked onto my laptop screen, where its own image was frozen in high-definition clarity. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something like confusion in its gaze. That's when I realized it recognized itself. This creature, this impossibility, was self-aware enough to understand what it was seeing, and somehow that was even more terrifying than the thought of being torn apart. We stayed like that, frozen in a bizarre tableau, for what felt like an eternity. Me, trembling in my chair, the creature, massive and terrifying, staring at its own image. I don't know what would have happened next if fate hadn't intervened. A sound from outside, a car engine, someone must have been driving down the old forest road, broke the spell. The creature's head snapped towards the noise, its ears twitching. Then, with one last look at me, it turned and bounded out of the cabin, disappearing into the night with shocking speed and silence. I sat there for hours, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. When the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally found the strength to stand on shaky legs. I walked to the door, half expecting to find it had all been some vivid hallucination, but the splintered wood, the massive claw marks gouged into the frame, told me it had all been real, too real. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my bags. I kept expecting to hear that growl again, to see those eyes peering at me from the tree line, but the forest remained quiet, almost peaceful in the morning light. As I drove away from the cabin, my mind raced. What was I going to do with this footage? Who would believe me? And more importantly, what were the consequences of revealing the existence of such a creature to the world? I still don't have the answers to those questions. The footage sits on an encrypted hard drive, hidden away where no one can find it. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and watch it again, just to remind myself that it wasn't all a dream. But every time I do, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the deep, dark woods, something is watching me, waiting, and someday, somehow, it's going to find me again. Because now I know the truth. The monsters are real, and they know we're looking for them. Story 7. The stench hit us first. A stomach-churning mix of rotting meat and something else, something primal and wrong. We'd been hiking for hours, pushing deeper into the backcountry than we ever had before, but nothing could have prepared us for what we found in that clearing, or for what found us. I'm Jake, and I've been leading hiking groups through these mountains for the better part of a decade. My buddy Mark and I had taken out a group of 5 experienced hikers on what was supposed to be a challenging but rewarding 5-day trek. We were 3 days in when everything went to hell. The morning had started like any other on the trail. We broke camp at dawn, everyone in high spirits despite the aching muscles and blistered feet. The weather was perfect, clear skies, a light breeze, and the promise of breathtaking views once we reached the ridge we'd been aiming for. We'd been making good time, the trail winding through dense pine forest. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of evergreens and wildflowers. It was the kind of day that reminded me why I loved this job, why I chose to spend my life out here in the wilderness. Around midday, we noticed the birds had gone quiet. It happened gradually at first, so subtle that I almost missed it, but after a while the silence became oppressive. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, not even the buzz of insects. Just the crunch of our boots on the trail and our own labored breathing as we climbed. "Jake," Mark called from the back of the group, his voice tight with concern. "You smell that?" I paused, taking a deep breath. That's when it hit me. That awful, cloying stench. It was faint at first, just on the edge of perception, but with each step we took, it grew stronger. "What is that?" Sarah, one of the hikers, asked, her nose wrinkling in disgust. I shook my head, trying to place the odor. "Not sure. Might be a dead animal nearby. Let's keep moving." But as we pressed on, the smell only intensified. It was all we could do not to gag. I was just about to suggest we turn back when the trail opened up into a small clearing. What we saw there will haunt me for the rest of my days. The clearing was littered with carcasses, deer mostly, their bodies torn apart and strewn across the forest floor. But there were other animals too. A bear, several coyotes, even what looked like the remains of a mountain lion. It was a scene of carnage unlike anything I'd ever encountered. "Jesus Christ," Mark whispered, his face pale. The group huddled together, shock and fear evident on every face. I tried to remain calm, to think rationally about what could have done this. A pack of wolves, maybe. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't right. The way the bodies were torn apart, the sheer scale of the killing, this was something else entirely. "We need to leave," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Now?" No one argued. We turned to go, eager to put as much distance between us and this nightmarish scene as possible. That's when we heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Time seemed to slow down. I turned, my eyes scanning the tree line. At first, I saw nothing. Then a shadow moved. No, not a shadow. Something massive. stepping out from behind a giant pine. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, easily 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I could name. It stood on 2 legs, its body a twisted amalgamation of wolf and man. Its snout was long, filled with teeth that gleamed in the dappled sunlight, and its eyes, God, its eyes. They burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For a moment, we all stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then someone screamed, I think it was Sarah, and the spell was broken. "Run!" I yelled, my voice cracking with terror. We took off, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for the trail. I could hear it behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Trees whipped past, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. But I didn't slow down, couldn't slow down. I glanced back just for a second and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was gaining on us, moving with a speed that defied its size. Its mouth was open in a snarl, saliva flying from its jaws. "There!" Mark shouted, pointing ahead. A rocky outcropping loomed before us, its sheer face rising at least 30 feet. At its base was a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Everyone in!" I ordered, skidding to a stop at the rock face. I ushered the group in first, watching in terror as the beast closed the distance between us. Mark went in next, then turned to help me. Just as I started to squeeze into the crevice, I felt something grab my ankle. White-hot pain shot up my leg as the creature's claws dug into my flesh. I kicked out blindly, my foot connecting with something solid. There was a yelp of pain, and suddenly I was free. Mark grabbed my arms, hauling me the rest of the way into the crevice. We pressed ourselves against the rock, our chests heaving as we struggled to catch our breath. The creature slammed into the rock face, its massive form blocking out the light from the entrance. It roared in frustration, a sound so loud and primal, it made the very stone around us vibrate. Its claws scrabbled at the opening, trying to reach us. But the gap was too narrow. For hours, we huddled in that crevice, listening to the thing outside as it paced and growled. The stench of its breath wafted in, making us gag. Occasionally, it would slam itself against the rock, as if trying to bring the whole formation down on top of us. As night fell, a new sound joined the creature's growls, howls, echoing through the forest. They started in the distance, but grew closer with each passing minute. The beast outside grew more agitated, its attacks on our shelter becoming more frenzied. "There's more of them," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded grimly. We were trapped, with no way out, and no way to call for help. Our only hope was that the creatures would give up and move on before we ran out of water or starved to death. But as the night wore on, it became clear that wasn't going to happen. The howls grew closer, and soon we could hear multiple sets of heavy footfalls outside our rocky prison. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, a beam of light cut through the darkness. Voices, human voices, called out, "A search party." They must have been sent out when we didn't make our scheduled check-in. "Help!" we screamed, our voices hoarse. "We're over here!" The beams of light swung in our direction. For a moment, hope surged through me. Then I remembered the creatures waiting outside. "No!" I shouted. "Stay back! There's something out there!" But it was too late. The night erupted into chaos. Growls, screams, gunshots. We could only listen in horror as the search party was torn apart. When silence finally fell, it was somehow worse than the noise. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, cautiously, I peered out of the crevice. The clearing was empty, no sign of the creatures, no sign of the search party, just a few scattered pieces of equipment and dark stains on the forest floor that I tried not to think about too hard. "I think they're gone," I whispered. Slowly, painfully, we extracted ourselves from our hiding place. The forest was quiet, the pre-dawn light casting everything in shades of grey. We gathered what supplies we could find and started the long, terrifying journey back to civilization. We made it, eventually, battered, traumatized, but alive. Of course, No one believed our story. The official report cited a bear attack, despite our protests. The carcasses in the clearing were never found, nor were any remains of the search party. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out into the darkness beyond my window. I know they're out there, those creatures, watching, waiting. And I can't help but wonder, how long before they decide to come out of the wilderness? How long before the rest of the world learns the truth? Because now I know the old legends, the campfire stories, they're all true. There are monsters in this world, and they're hungry. Story 8. The footprints weren't there when I started the hike. I was sure of it. I'd been walking for hours, heading up the trail toward the snowy ridge where I planned to camp for the night. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground, when I noticed them, huge, deep, and spaced far apart, footprints that looked like they belonged to something far bigger than any animal I'd ever seen out here. I stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in the cold air, mist rising in front of me. I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. Nothing. The forest was quiet, the only sound the soft crunch of snow under my boots as I shifted uneasily. But those footprints were fresh, too fresh. The prints were humanoid, but wrong, far too large, and the shape was all off. The toes were elongated, almost claw-like, with a deep arch in the middle that suggested weight, a lot of weight. My first thought was that someone was messing with me. Maybe some prankster had come through, trying to scare hikers, but the prints stretched far ahead of me, disappearing up the trail toward the ridge where I was headed. I glanced over my shoulder. The trail behind me was untouched. If someone had come through, they hadn't passed me, which meant whatever made those prints, it was still up there, ahead of me. I swallowed hard, my stomach knotting. I could turn back. The thought crossed my mind more than once as I stood there, staring at those massive prints, but the ridge was close, and I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. I told myself it was nothing. Just some oversized animal or maybe a weird trick of the snow. Nothing to worry about, so I kept walking. The air grew colder as I climbed higher, the temperature dropping quickly as the sun slipped behind the mountains. My breath came in short, visible puffs, and I adjusted the straps of my pack, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that crept up my spine with every step. The footprints stayed ahead of me, winding up the trail, their strange shape imprinted deeply in the snow. I tried to focus on other things, the sound of the wind through the trees, the crunch of my boots, the faint smell of pine and cold earth. But every few steps, I found myself glancing at those prints, my mind racing with possibilities. Bears didn't leave prints like that. Neither did wolves, and there were no people out here this late in the season. At least, there shouldn't have been. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and darkness started to creep in around me. I was close to the ridge now, close to where I planned to set up camp for the night. The air was so still, it felt oppressive, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then I heard it, a branch snapping somewhere off to my right. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, ears prickling in the silence. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't just a single snap. There were heavy, deliberate footsteps now, crunching through the snow just beyond the tree line, out of sight. Whatever it was big, and it was moving toward me. I scanned the trees, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. Shadows danced between the branches, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped. Silence. My pulse pounded in my ears, and I stood there rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I didn't. I don't know why, but something in me, curiosity maybe, kept me there, listening, waiting for the next sound. My breath was shallow, my fingers cold and numb around the handle of the flashlight, and then I saw it, a figure, tall and hulking, just barely visible between the trees. It was moving slowly, deliberately, its massive frame half hidden in the shadows. It was walking upright, like a person, but its silhouette was all wrong. Broad shoulders, long arms that hung low, and a head that seemed to blend into the thick neck and hunched back. The creature paused, as if sensing my presence, and turned slightly. That's when I saw its eyes. They glowed faintly in the darkness, two yellow orbs that locked onto me with an intensity that sent a cold rush of fear through my entire body. I stood frozen, flashlight still pointed toward it, though I could barely move. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. It was too large to be human, and yet there was something disturbingly human about the way it moved, the way it watched me. Then it let out a sound, a low, rumbling growl that reverberated through the trees, deep and guttural, like a warning. My legs finally responded, and I stumbled backward, the fear finally breaking through whatever had kept me in place. The flashlight beam swung wildly as I scrambled to put distance between myself and the thing. The growl grew louder, and I heard heavy footsteps crashing through the snow toward me. I turned and ran. The cold air burned in my lungs as I sprinted down the trail, my pack bouncing against my back. The snow made it hard to move quickly, and I could hear the thing crashing through the trees behind me, closing the distance with terrifying speed. My heart pounded, and every part of me screamed to move faster, but the snow dragged at my feet, slowing me down. I veered off the trail, my boots slipping as I plunged into the trees, hoping to lose it in the dense undergrowth. Branches whipped at my face, stinging as I pushed forward, trying to ignore the deafening sound of the creature's pursuit behind me. My legs were burning, but I didn't dare stop. I couldn't. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. I stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, my ears straining for any sound. Silence. The forest was still again, as if nothing had happened. I slowly turned, shining my flashlight back toward the direction I had come from. Nothing, just the dark shapes of trees, their branches swaying gently in the wind. But I knew it was still out there, watching me, waiting. I didn't move for a long time, standing there in the cold, trying to steady my breathing, trying to figure out what to do next. My camp was still up the ridge, but there was no way I was going back that way now. Not with that thing lurking somewhere in the dark. Instead, I decided to make for the lower trailhead, the one that would eventually lead me back to my car, miles away. I had a small emergency shelter in my pack, and if I could find a safe spot, maybe I could wait out the night and hike back in the morning. I started walking again, slower this time, every nerve in my body on edge. The forest felt different now, darker, more menacing. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of a branch made me flinch. The trees seemed to close in around me, the path ahead disappearing into the blackness. And then I heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. The thing was still following me, keeping its distance, but not letting me out of its sight. I couldn't see it, but I could hear it, always just on the edge of the darkness, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. It was toying with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. Panic started to creep in, but I forced it down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. I just had to keep moving. The footsteps followed me for what felt like hours, always just out of reach, like a shadow lurking in the corner of my vision. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the trees thinned, and I spotted the outline of the trailhead in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The footsteps stopped again, closer this time, and I felt the familiar weight of its gaze on me. I turned slowly, flashlight shaking in my hand, and there it was, standing just at the edge of the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, its massive form blending into the darkness. The yellow eyes glowed faintly as it watched me, unmoving. For a long moment we stood there, staring at each other, neither of us making a sound. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew if I turned my back on it again, it would come for me. But I had no choice. I had to keep moving. I backed away, never taking my eyes off the thing until I reached the trailhead. Then I turned and ran, sprinting down the path toward my car, the cold air stinging my lungs, the fear pushing me forward. When I finally reached the parking lot, I didn't stop running until I was inside the car. The door slammed shut behind me. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking, heart racing, and peeled out of there without looking back. To this day, I don't know what that thing was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never hike that trail again. Some things are better left unseen. Story 9. The distress call crackled through our radio, breaking the monotonous silence of our night shift. A hiker, lost somewhere in the depths of Black Rock Canyon, her voice trembling with fear as she begged for help. Little did we know that by answering that call, we were about to become the ones in need of rescue. I'm Sergeant Sarah Connor, leader of the Pinecrest Mountain Search and Rescue Team. For 15 years, I've been scaling cliffs, rappelling into ravines, and trekking through some of the most unforgiving terrain this side of the Rockies to save lives. I thought I'd seen it all, faced every challenge these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It was just past midnight when the call came in. My team, consisting of myself, our medical expert doctor, Mike Chen, and our tracking specialist Jake Thompson, was on standby at our base camp, halfway up Pinecrest Mountain. We'd been monitoring a storm system that was supposed to roll in later that week, making sure all the trails were clear of hikers. The voice on the radio was barely audible through the static, but the panic was clear. Please, someone, help me. I'm lost. There's something out here. I grabbed the radio, trying to establish a clearer connection. This is Sergeant Connor with Pinecrest Search and Rescue. Can you hear me? What's your location? More static. Then, I don't know. Somewhere in Black Rock Canyon. I went off trail and, oh God, I can hear it again. Please hurry. The transmission cut off abruptly. I looked at Mike and Jake, seeing my own concern mirrored in their faces. Black Rock Canyon was notorious for its treacherous terrain and unreliable radio signals, and there was something about the hiker's last words that sent a chill down my spine. Gear up, I ordered, pushing my unease aside. We're heading out in 5. We loaded our packs with supplies for a 48-hour search: food, water, first aid kits, climbing gear, and emergency beacons. As we piled into our off-road vehicle, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial. The drive to Black Rock Canyon was tense. The full moon cast eerie shadows across the landscape, turning familiar landmarks into looming, sinister shapes. We parked at the trailhead and continued on foot, our powerful flashlights cutting through the darkness. Let's spread out, I said as we reached the canyon proper. Standard search pattern. Radio check every 15 minutes. If you find anything, no matter how small, call it in immediately. We separated, each taking a different section of the canyon. The walls of rock rose high on either side of me, creating a claustrophobic tunnel effect. My flashlight beam seemed swallowed by the darkness, barely penetrating a few feet ahead. An hour passed with no sign of our lost hiker. Then, too, the oppressive silence of the canyon was broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots and my own labored breathing as I climbed over boulders and squeezed through narrow passages. It was during one of these tight squeezes that I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, almost below the threshold of hearing. At first, I thought it was just the wind echoing through the canyon, but as I paused to listen, I realized it was something else entirely. Something alive. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. It was Jake, his voice tight with tension. Sarge, I found something. You need to see this. I backtracked to our agreed rendezvous point, meeting up with Mike along the way. We found Jake standing in a small clearing, his flashlight trained on the ground. Look, he said, pointing. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The ground was torn up, great furrows gouged into the earth. Scattered around were pieces of fabric, shredded beyond recognition, and there, half hidden under a bush, was a hiking boot. It was empty. What could have done this? Mike whispered, his medical training warring with the impossibility of what we were seeing. Before I could answer, that sound came again, louder this time, echoing off the canyon walls. It wasn't a growl, wasn't a roar. It was something in between, primeval and terrifying. We need to move, I said, my instinct screaming at me to run, now. We turned to go, only to find our path blocked. There, not 20 feet away, stood something. In the harsh glare of our flashlights, I could make out matted fur, muscles rippling under a massive frame. It stood on 2 legs, easily 8 feet tall, but it was the face that turned my blood to ice. A twisted mixture of wolf and bear, with eyes that gleamed with an unnatural intelligence. For a moment, we all stood frozen, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. Then the creature let out that bone-chilling sound again, and we broke. "Run!" I yelled, though I hardly needed to. We took off down the canyon, all thoughts of search patterns and protocol forgotten. I could hear it behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. Rocks clattered down the canyon walls. Whether from its passage or our own frantic flight, I couldn't tell. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs felt like lead, but every time we thought we'd lost it, that sound would come again, closer than before. It was toying with us, I realized, with growing horror. This wasn't a pursuit, it was a hunt. As we rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake stumbled, crying out in pain. Mike and I skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. "My ankle," he gasped. "I think it's broken." I looked back the way we'd come, seeing shadows move in the darkness. We were out of time. "There," Mike pointed to a narrow crevice in the canyon wall. "We can hide in there." Together, we half-carried, half-dragged Jake to the opening. It was a tight squeeze, but we managed to wedge ourselves inside just as the creature rounded the corner. It approached slowly, almost leisurely, secure in the knowledge that we were trapped. In the moonlight that filtered down into the canyon, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered, a patchwork of nightmares made flesh. For hours, we huddled in that crevice, hardly daring to breathe. The creature paced outside, occasionally swiping at the opening with claws that left deep gouges in the rock. The stench of its breath, a horrifying mix of decay and musk, wafted in, making us gag. As the night wore on, other sounds joined the creature's growls, howls, echoing through the canyon. They started in the distance, but grew closer with each passing minute. "There's more of them," Jake whispered, his face pale with pain and fear. I nodded grimly, my mind racing. We were trapped, with no way out and no way to call for help. Our radios were useless this deep in the canyon, and our emergency beacons were in our packs, which we dropped during our mad dash for safety. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, a new sound cut through the night, a human voice, calling out, "Hello, is anyone there? This is Ranger Stevens. We're looking for a search and rescue team." My heart leapt. A ranger patrol. They must have been sent out when we missed our check-in. For a moment, hope surged through me. Then I remembered the creatures waiting outside. "No!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Stay back! There's something out here!" But it was too late. The night erupted into chaos. Growls, screams, gunshots. We could only listen in horror as the ranger patrol met the same fate as the lost hiker we'd come to rescue. When silence finally fell, it was somehow worse than the noise. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, for what felt like hours. Then, slowly, cautiously, I peered out of the crevice. The canyon was empty. No sign of the creatures, no sign of the ranger patrol. Just scattered pieces of equipment and dark stains on the rock that I tried not to think about too hard. "I think they're gone," I whispered, slowly, painfully. We extracted ourselves from our hiding place. The pre-dawn light cast everything in shades of grey, making the canyon look alien and hostile. We gathered what supplies we could find and started the long, terrifying journey back to civilization. We made it, eventually, battered, traumatized, but alive. Of course, no one believed our story. The official report cited a bear attack, despite our protests. No trace was ever found of the lost hiker or the ranger patrol. I've been on leave since that night, unable to shake the memories of what we encountered in Black Rock Canyon. Sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I can hear that sound again, that terrible, inhuman howl. I know they're out there, those creatures watching, waiting, and I can't help but wonder how long before they strike again, how long before the rest of the world learns the truth. Because now I know we're not the apex predators we thought we were. There are things out there, ancient and powerful, that see us as nothing more than prey, and sooner or later they're going to get hungry again. Story 10. It was just supposed to be another routine call. We'd gotten reports of strange sounds, animalistic cries, some campers said, in a remote area of the forest. It wasn't unusual. People hear things out in the woods all the time and jump to wild conclusions. Coyotes, owls, wind through the trees. It's easy to misinterpret the sounds of nature, especially when you're out there alone in the dark. But this report had come from multiple people over the course of several nights. So they sent me and Alex, another ranger, to check it out. I didn't think much of it at first. We'd been doing this for years, searching for lost hikers, investigating odd noises, and generally just keeping people from getting themselves into trouble. But as soon as we got out of the truck and started walking into the woods, something felt off. The air was cold, colder than it should have been for this time of year. There was a stillness to it, like the forest was holding its breath. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just silence. "You feel that?" Alex asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. There was something strange about that silence, something that gnawed at the back of my mind and made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't like it. Neither did Alex. We pushed deeper into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The sun was already starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. My flashlight was clipped to my belt, but I didn't want to pull it out just yet. The last thing I needed was to start thinking about what might be lurking in those shadows. Then we found the deer. It was lying just off the trail, its body mutilated, torn open like something had taken its time with it. I've seen animals attacked by predators before, bears, wolves, but this was different. The deer wasn't eaten, not really. It was just destroyed, its legs twisted at unnatural angles, its stomach ripped open, but the meat left untouched. Just raw, brutal violence. "Jesus," Alex muttered, crouching down to get a better look. What the hell could have done this? I shook my head, my throat tight. I didn't have an answer. Nothing that made sense, anyway. "We should report this," Alex said, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. "Maybe a bear's gone rabid or something." "Yeah," I said, reaching for my radio. But when I clicked the button, all I got was static. I tried again. More static. I glanced over at Alex, and he tried his own radio, with the same result. We were deep in the woods. Sure, but not so far that we shouldn't have gotten some kind of signal. That gnawing feeling in the back of my mind grew stronger. I wanted to get out of there, and fast. But before we could turn back, we heard it. A voice, crackling through the static on the radio. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was there. "Help!" Alex and I exchanged a look, both of us frozen in place. The voice came again, this time louder, clearer. "Help me!" It sounded like a man's voice, weak and strained, like he was in pain. But there was something off about it, something that didn't quite fit, like the words were right, but the tone was wrong. "Who's there?" Alex said into the radio, his voice tense. "This is Ranger Station 4. Do you need assistance?" The radio crackled again, and the voice responded, "Help me." It sent a chill down my spine. Alex shook his head and tried again. "Where are you? What's your location?" Silence. "We have to find him," Alex said, already stepping off the trail, heading deeper into the woods. "He could be hurt." I wanted to argue, to tell him we should head back to the truck and call in for backup, but the desperation in the voice on the radio, it was hard to ignore. So I followed Alex, even though every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around. We moved through the trees, the light fading quickly, making the shadows grow longer and darker. My breath was coming in short bursts now, more from nerves than exertion. The deeper we went, the worse that feeling in my gut got. I couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. The radio crackled again, and the voice came through, louder this time. "Help me, please." I stopped, shining my flashlight into the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just more trees, more shadows. The voice echoed in my head, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. It hadn't answered Alex's questions. It just kept repeating the same words. "Help me, please," over and over. "Alex," I said, my voice tight. "I think something's wrong." He glanced back at me, but before he could respond, there was a sound, something moving through the trees behind us. Something big. We both spun around, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but we didn't see anything. "I don't like this," I said, taking a step back. Alex's face had gone pale, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun on his belt. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Because then we saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the darkness, hunched over and moving slowly between the trees. But as it got closer, my flashlight caught it, and I froze. It was tall, far too tall to be a person, with long, spindly limbs that didn't seem to bend right. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over a gaunt, skeletal frame. Its head was wrong, too long, too narrow, with hollow, sunken eyes that glowed faintly in the beam of my light. And then it spoke. "Help me!" It rasped, the words mangled, twisted, like it was trying to mimic a human voice but didn't quite understand how. Alex swore under his breath, stumbling backward. My heart was racing, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in its gaze as it slowly, painfully took another step toward us. "Help me!" The words slithered out of its mouth like a sick joke, its voice grating and broken. And then, without warning, it lunged. Alex shouted, grabbing my arm and yanking me backward as the creature came at us, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. We bolted, sprinting through the trees, the sound of its footsteps thundering behind us. "Go, go," Alex shouted, shoving me forward as we crashed through the underbrush. I could hear the thing behind us, its guttural breathing growing louder, closer. We didn't stop running. Not until we could see the faint glow of the truck's headlights through the trees. I stumbled, gasping for breath, my legs burning from the effort. Alex grabbed me, pulling me up, and we made it to the truck just as the creature burst from the tree line. It stood there just beyond the reach of the headlights, its hollow eyes locked on us, its chest heaved, its limbs twitching as it stared at us with that terrible, twisted grin. "Help me," it whispered again, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't asking. It was mocking us. Alex slammed the truck into gear, and we tore out of there, the creature vanishing into the darkness behind us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. The only sound, the rumble of the engine and the rapid thud of my heartbeat in my ears. When we finally made it back to the ranger station, we told our supervisor about the deer, about the voice, about the creature in the woods, but they didn't believe us. No one did. They said it was just a bear, or maybe a trick of the light, that we were tired, spooked, and imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw, what I heard, and I'll never forget the way it looked at us, standing there in the dark, with those hollow eyes and that voice that wasn't human. It was still out there, waiting, and whatever it wasn't asking for help. Story 11. The first time I saw them, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. It was just after sunset, that dusky hour when the light starts to fade and shadows stretch long across the ground. I was camping with my family, me, my wife Emily, and our 2 kids, Ava and Noah. We'd found a nice spot in the woods, not too far from the river, with plenty of room to pitch the tent and set up a fire. The kids were roasting marshmallows, laughing and chatting, and everything seemed perfect, peaceful. But then I looked up, toward the tree line, and that's when I saw them. There were figures standing just beyond the trees. I couldn't make out much, just tall, dark shapes, motionless, as if they were watching us. At first, I told myself it was nothing, just trees or maybe the way the fading light was casting shadows. But the longer I stared, the more certain I became that they were there, watching. A shiver ran down my spine, but I didn't want to freak anyone out, especially not the kids, so I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was just my imagination. I'd been camping 100 times before, but something about that place felt different. The air was too still, the woods too quiet. I nudged Emily, nodding toward the trees. "Do you see that?" She glanced up from where she was helping Ava with her marshmallow. "See what?" I pointed, but by then the figures were gone. The tree line was empty, just a row of dark trunks fading into the gathering night. "Nothing," I said, forcing a laugh that sounded more strained than I intended. "Just thought I saw something." Emily gave me a look but didn't press it. She had a way of knowing when something was bothering me, but she also knew when not to push. "You're probably just tired," she said, turning back to the kids. "Why don't you sit down? Relax." I nodded, but the unease gnawed at me. I couldn't stop thinking about those shapes in the woods, the way they'd stood there, perfectly still, like they were waiting for something or someone. Later that night, after we'd put the kids to bed, Emily and I sat by the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. The air had grown colder, and the forest around us was eerily quiet, too quiet. No wind, no rustling leaves, no sound of wildlife, just silence. "I don't like this place," I said finally, staring into the fire. "It feels off." Emily sipped her tea, frowning. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. It's like—" I hesitated, not sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid. "Earlier, I thought I saw something at the tree line, like people out here." "Yeah, I know how it sounds, but there were these shapes, tall, just standing there." Emily's eyes flicked toward the trees, her expression thoughtful. "Could have been shadows. You know how your mind plays tricks on you when it gets dark." "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. The fire crackled between us, and I could feel the weight of the forest pressing in. It was as though the woods themselves were watching us, waiting for something. I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see those figures again, lurking in the darkness. We eventually went to bed, crawling into the tent with the kids. Emily fell asleep quickly, her breathing slow and steady beside me, but I couldn't. My mind was racing, replaying the moment I'd seen those figures. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured them standing there, watching us from the shadows. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. At first, it was just a faint rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. I sat up, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. I grabbed the flashlight from beside my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The cold night air rushed in, and I shivered as I stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the campsite. I scanned the perimeter with the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing, just darkness, but I could still hear it. Something moving in the woods, just beyond the reach of the light. The sound was deliberate, slow, like whatever it was didn't care if it was heard. It wanted me to know it was there. I shined the light toward the tree line again, my pulse racing, and that's when I saw them. 2 tall figures, standing just inside the trees. This time, there was no mistaking it. They were there watching. Their bodies were long and thin, almost unnaturally so, and their eyes, God, their eyes were glowing. A faint, sickly yellow that pierced through the darkness. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. For a long moment, neither of us moved. They just stood there, staring at me with those glowing eyes, completely still. My hand tightened on the flashlight, and I felt a surge of panic rise up in my chest. I wanted to call out for Emily, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't make a sound. It was like something had clamped down on my throat, holding me in place. Then one of the figures moved. It stepped forward, out of the shadows into the faint light of the dying fire. My heart nearly stopped. The thing was tall, easily over 7 feet, and with long, gangly limbs and a body covered in matted fur. Its face was elongated, like that of an animal, but its eyes, those eyes were human, too human. It took another step toward me, and I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I tried to retreat. My flashlight fell from my hand, clattering to the ground, the beam spinning wildly before flickering out. In the darkness, I could hear the thing breathing, slow, deep breaths, almost like it was savoring the moment. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering in my chest, trying to get to the tent. I could feel my breath coming in short, panicked gasps, and my hands shook as I fumbled for the zipper. Just as I got it open, I heard Emily stir behind me. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was too terrified to make a sound. I dragged myself into the tent, pulling the zipper shut as quickly and quietly as I could. Inside, it was pitch black, but at least it felt safer than out there. Emily sat up, confused. "Why are you back in here? What?" "Shh," I whispered, my voice trembling. "There's something out there." She froze, listening. For a moment, there was only silence, and I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then the footsteps started again, slow and heavy, circling the tent. Emily's eyes widened, and she grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "What is that?" she whispered, barely able to get the words out. "I don't know," I breathed, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. We held our breath, listening, and then the tent fabric shifted, as if something was pressing against it from the outside. I could hear it sniffing, a deep, wet sound, like it was trying to catch our scent. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat, the terror overwhelming me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but I was paralyzed. All I could do was wait, praying that whatever it was would lose interest and leave. The thing pressed harder against the tent, its shadow looming over us, and I thought for sure it was going to rip the fabric apart. My mind raced with images of those glowing eyes, those impossibly long limbs, and that grotesque, animalistic face. But then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. The forest fell silent once again. Neither of us moved for what felt like hours. We just sat there, holding each other, waiting to see if it would come back. But it didn't. The next morning, we packed up the campsite in record time. The kids were confused, asking why we were leaving so soon, but we didn't tell them. How could we? We didn't even understand it ourselves. As we hiked back to the car, I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see those figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching us, but they never appeared. Even now, weeks later, I can't get those eyes out of my head. That night, those glowing eyes told me one thing: I'd never been alone out there, and next time, I might not be so lucky. Story 12. The image on my trail camera shouldn't exist. I've spent 20 years in these woods, tracking every creature that calls them home. But this was something else entirely. As I stared at the screen, my blood ran cold, because deep down, I knew whatever I'd captured on film was now hunting me. My name's John Hawkins. I'm a wildlife biologist, specializing in large predators, particularly wolves and bears. For the past 5 years, I've been studying the impact of climate change on predator populations in the North Cascades. It's solitary work, just me and the wilderness. But I've always loved it. At least, I did until that night. It started innocently enough. I'd set up a new trail camera near a game trail I'd been monitoring. Nothing unusual about that. I have dozens of cameras scattered throughout my research area. But this one was special. It was a prototype, equipped with the latest in motion-sensing technology and high-definition night vision, perfect for capturing clear images of nocturnal predators. I'd left it out for a week, excited to see what it might reveal about the local wolf pack I'd been tracking. When I hiked out to retrieve the memory card, everything seemed normal. The camera was intact, No signs of animal interference. I remember thinking how lucky I was. Bears often find these cameras irresistible toys. Back at my cabin, I settled in to review the footage. The first few days were exactly what I expected. Deer, elk, the occasional black bear. But then, on the fifth night, something changed. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. At first, the frame was empty, just moonlit forest. Then, a blur of movement. I leaned closer, squinting at the screen. Whatever it was big and fast. Too fast for a bear or a wolf. I slowed the footage down, advancing frame by frame. That's when I saw it. My breath caught in my throat, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It stood upright, easily 7 feet tall. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, but the shape was all wrong for a bear. The limbs were too long, too human-like, but it was the face that truly terrified me. It was caught in mid-snarl. It was a nightmarish fusion of wolf and man. The elongated snout was filled with teeth that would put a timber wolf to shame. And the eyes, God, those eyes, they glowed with an unnatural intelligence, seeming to stare right through the camera. I sat there staring at my screen in disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be a hoax, a man in a costume, something. But deep down, I knew. This was no hoax. I'd captured something on film that shouldn't exist. My first instinct was to call someone, my research partner, the Park Service, anyone. But who would believe me? I'd be laughed out of the scientific community. No, I needed more evidence. I needed to go back out there. I spent the next day preparing. I checked and rechecked my gear, loaded my backpack with supplies, and made sure my satellite phone was fully charged. As the sun began to set, I set out into the darkening forest. The hike to the camera location was tense. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush sent my heart racing. The forest felt different at night, alive in a way I'd never experienced before. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached the camera, everything looked normal. No signs of disturbance, no strange tracks. I quickly swapped out the memory card, eager to get back to the relative safety of my cabin. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the bear spray on my belt. Slowly, I turned, scanning the darkness around me. Nothing, just shadows and trees. But I knew it was out there, watching, waiting. I started back towards the cabin, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, trying to snag my clothes and slow me down. The growl came again, closer this time, much closer. I broke into a run, all pretense of stealth forgotten. I could hear it now, crashing through the underbrush behind me. It was toying with me, I realized. It could have caught me at any time. This was a game to it. Somehow, I made it back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut behind me, fumbling with the locks. For a moment, there was silence. Then a heavy thud against the door made me stumble backward. Another impact, and the wood began to splinter. In a panic, I retreated to my workspace, frantically pulling the memory card from my pocket and inserting it into my laptop. If I was going to die here, at least there would be evidence of what happened. The footage began to load as another crash echoed through the cabin, and that's when I saw it. No longer just an image on my screen, but right there, in my doorway. The creature filled the entire frame, its massive body hunched to fit through the entrance. This close, I could smell its musky animal odor, could see the saliva dripping from its fangs. It took a step forward, its claws clicking on the wooden floor. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to think. This was it. This was how it ended. But then, inexplicably, it stopped. Its nostrils flared, sniffing the air. Those terrifying eyes locked onto my laptop screen, where its own image was frozen in high-definition clarity. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something like confusion in its gaze. That's when I realized it recognized itself. This creature, this impossibility, was self-aware enough to understand what it was seeing, and somehow that was even more terrifying than the thought of being torn apart. We stayed like that, frozen in a bizarre tableau, for what felt like an eternity. Me, trembling in my chair, the creature, massive and terrifying, staring at its own image. I don't know what would have happened next if fate hadn't intervened. A sound from outside, a wolf howl, distant but clear, broke the spell. The creature's head snapped towards the noise, its ears twitching. Then, with one last look at me, it turned and bounded out of the cabin, disappearing into the night with shocking speed and silence. I sat there for hours, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. When the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows, I finally found the strength to stand on shaky legs. I walked to the door, half expecting to find it had all been some vivid hallucination. But the splintered wood, the massive claw marks gouged into the frame, told me it had all been real, too real. I packed up my gear in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip my bags. I kept expecting to hear that growl again, to see those eyes peering at me from the tree line, but the forest remained quiet, almost peaceful in the morning light. As I drove away from the cabin, my mind raced. What was I going to do with this footage? Who would believe me? And more importantly, what were the consequences of revealing the existence of such a creature to the world? I still don't have the answers to those questions. The footage sits on an encrypted hard drive, hidden away where no one can find it. Sometimes, late at night, I take it out and watch it again, just to remind myself that it wasn't all a dream. But every time I do, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere out there in the deep, dark woods, something is watching me, waiting, and someday, somehow, it's going to find me again, because now I know the truth. The creatures we've dismissed as myth and legend, they're real. They've been out there all along, hiding in the shadows of our world, and they know we're looking for them. I've left my research position, moved to the city, but I can't escape the memories, the knowledge of what's out there. Every time I see a forest, every time I hear a wolf howl, I'm back in that cabin, staring into those impossibly intelligent eyes. I don't know what it was. A cryptid, a government experiment gone wrong, some evolutionary offshoot we've never encountered before. But I know it's real, and I know it's not alone. Sometimes I wonder if I should release the footage, tell the world what I've seen, but then I think about the consequences, the panic, the hunt that would follow, and I wonder, are we ready for that truth, or are some secrets better left in the dark? All I know is that I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. Because now, when I stare into the forest, I know it's staring back, and somewhere out there, in the deepest, darkest woods, something is waiting, watching, and maybe, just maybe, it's evolving. The question isn't whether these creatures exist anymore. It's what happens when they decide to stop hiding, and I fear that day may come sooner than we think. Story 13. We'd been out there for hours, but it wasn't until the sun started setting that I felt it, the sense that something was following us. At first, it was just a feeling, that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, like eyes are watching you from the shadows. I brushed it off as paranoia. It was late in the day, and the light was fading fast. The woods were getting darker, quieter, and I figured I was just spooking myself. But then I noticed that whenever we stopped walking, the sounds behind us stopped too, every time. "Hey man, you good?" Jake called out from up ahead, snapping me out of my thoughts. I glanced at him and forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." He nodded and adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder. "We were out here for deer, but after hours of tracking, we hadn't seen anything." The woods were unusually still, not even the rustle of leaves or the distant call of birds, and that silence was starting to weigh on me. But it wasn't just the quiet, it was that feeling, the one that makes the hair on your arm stand up for no reason. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the typical isolation of being out in the woods too long, but my gut wasn't convinced. Something felt off. We pushed deeper into the forest, hoping to make it back to the truck before dark. The trail we were on was overgrown, barely visible beneath the layer of fallen leaves, but Jake swore it would lead us back to the main path. I trusted him. He'd hunted out here more times than I could count. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept into my bones with every step. The trees felt too close, the air too thick. I found myself glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, expecting to see something, but there was never anything there, just trees, endless trees. "You hear that?" I asked suddenly, stopping in my tracks. Jake turned around, frowning. "Hear what?" I hesitated. It was faint, but there was something, like branches snapping just beyond the tree line. Too far to see, but close enough to make me nervous. "Probably a deer," Jake said, though his voice didn't carry much conviction. He glanced into the trees, then back at me. "Let's keep moving." We walked in silence for another mile or so, but the feeling never left. If anything, it grew stronger. There was something out there, moving in the woods just beyond our sight, pacing us. I could hear it now, faint but unmistakable. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate. I quickened my pace, trying to keep up with Jake, who seemed oblivious to it all. But then, as we rounded a bend in the trail, I caught a glimpse of something, just for a split second, out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, tall and broad, moving between the trees. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. "Jake," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. He turned, noticing the panic on my face. "What? What is it?" "There's something out there," I said, pointing toward the trees. "I saw it. Something big." Jake frowned, scanning the woods with narrowed eyes. "Probably just a bear." "No," I said, shaking my head. "It was standing up, on two legs." He looked at me for a long moment, like he wasn't sure if I was messing with him or not. Then, without a word, he unslung his rifle and started walking toward the trees. What the hell are you doing?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Are you crazy?" "I'm checking it out," he said, pulling free. "If it's a bear, we need to know. And if it's something else, well, we've got guns." I didn't like it. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and head back the way we came. But I couldn't let Jake go in alone. So, reluctantly, I followed him into the trees, my hand resting on the grip of my rifle. The deeper we went, the darker it got. The thick canopy above blocked out most of the remaining light, leaving the forest bathed in shadows. Every twig snap, every rustle of leaves had me on edge. My nerves wound so tight I thought I might snap. We walked in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath our boots. Then, suddenly, Jake stopped and held up a hand. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "What is it?" I whispered. He didn't answer right away, just pointed at the ground in front of us. I stepped closer and saw what he was looking at. Footprints, huge, deep footprints pressed into the soft earth. They weren't human. They were too large, too wide, with claw marks at the tips of each toe. "What the hell?" I breathed, my stomach twisting in knots. "Could be a bear," Jake muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. "No bear leaves tracks like that." We both stared at the footprints for a moment, neither of us sure what to say. The prints led deeper into the woods, disappearing into the darkness between the trees. Jake took a step forward, following the tracks. "Are you serious?" I hissed, grabbing his arm again. "We should get the hell out of here." But he didn't budge. "Whatever made these tracks is still out here," he said, his voice low. "And I want to know what it is." I wanted to argue, but I could see the stubborn determination in his eyes. There was no talking him out of it. So, with a knot of dread tightening in my gut, I followed him deeper into the woods. The air grew colder as we walked, the light fading until we were barely able to see a few feet ahead. The trees loomed taller, their branches twisting overhead like skeletal arms. Every now and then, I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing, and then we heard it. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the trees. It came from somewhere ahead, just beyond the next rise. My blood turned to ice, and I stopped in my tracks, gripping my rifle so tight my knuckles turned white. Jake glanced back at me, his face pale. "You hear that?" I nodded, too afraid to speak. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. Whatever it wasn't far. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breath came in short, panicked bursts. I wanted to run, to get the hell out of there, but my feet were frozen in place. Then something moved in the darkness ahead. At first, it was just a shadow, shifting between the trees. But as it got closer, I realized it was something much, much bigger. The creature was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and it moved on 2 legs, its long, muscular arms hanging low at its sides. Its fur was dark and matted, blending into the shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, a sickly yellow that sent a wave of terror through me. "Jake," I whispered, my voice barely audible. He didn't respond. He was staring at the thing, his rifle half raised, his mouth slightly open in shock. The creature let out another low growl, its eyes locked on us. It took a step forward, its massive feet sinking into the earth, and I felt the ground vibrate beneath me. "Run!" I whispered, barely able to get the word out. "Run!" Jake didn't need any more convincing. He bolted, and I was right behind him, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face as we sprinted back toward the trail. I could hear the thing behind us, its heavy footsteps pounding the ground, getting closer with every second. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The thing was right behind us, and I knew if we slowed down, it would catch us. We broke through the tree line and back onto the trail, and for a brief moment I thought we might make it. But then I heard a deafening roar, and something slammed into Jake, sending him crashing to the ground. I skidded to a halt, turning just in time to see the creature standing over him, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. Jake let out a scream, scrambling backward, but the thing didn't attack. It just stared. Its glowing eyes locked onto him, as if deciding whether or not he was worth the effort. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it turned and lumbered back into the trees, disappearing into the shadows without a sound. I ran to Jake, my heart pounding, and helped him to his feet. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. We just ran, not stopping until we reached the truck, panting and shaking, our bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. We never went back to those woods. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something we were meant to find. Story 14. The moment I saw those ancient cave paintings, I knew we'd made a terrible mistake. The twisted, elongated figures with their antlered heads and emaciated bodies weren't the product of primitive imaginations. They were a warning we were about to ignore, with catastrophic consequences. My name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm an archaeologist specializing in prehistoric art. When my team and I set out to explore a newly discovered cave system in the remote wilderness of northern Canada, we thought we were on the verge of a groundbreaking discovery. Little did we know we were about to uncover something that should have remained hidden. Our expedition had started routinely enough. We'd spent weeks carefully mapping the cave system, documenting every twist and turn of the winding passages. The deeper we went, the more excited we became. The limestone walls were a treasure trove of ancient art, depicting scenes of daily life, hunting rituals, and what we assumed were spiritual beliefs of a long-lost culture. But as we pushed further into the heart of the mountain, the artwork began to change. The human figures became more stylized, more wrong. Limbs stretched to impossible lengths, faces elongated into muzzles filled with sharp teeth, and always those antlers, branching and twisting like something out of a nightmare. "What do you make of this, Elena?" my colleague, Dr. Tom Chen, asked as we stood before a particularly disturbing panel. The flickering light of our headlamps cast eerie shadows across the cave wall, making the painted figures seem to move. I shook my head, struggling to find words. I've never seen anything like it. These don't match any known art style from this region or time period. As I leaned in for a closer look, a gust of wind whistled through the cave, carrying with it a musty, animal smell. I shivered, suddenly acutely aware of how far we were from the surface, from civilization. Maybe we should head back, Sarah, our team's geologist, suggested. That storm's supposed to hit tonight, and I don't like the idea of being trapped down here. I nodded, but my eyes were drawn to a dark opening at the far end of the chamber. Just one more passage, I said. And I want to see where it leads. That decision would haunt me for the rest of my life. The passage was narrow, forcing us to go single file. The air grew colder, damper, as we descended. The walls here were bare of artwork, but something about them seemed off. It wasn't until Tom ran his hand along the surface that we realized what it was. "These aren't natural," he said, his voice tight with excitement and a hint of fear. These walls were carved. Before I could respond, the passage opened up into a vast chamber. Our headlamps barely penetrated the darkness, but what they revealed stole the breath from my lungs. In the center of the chamber stood a circle of standing stones, each easily 20 feet tall. They were covered in carvings, the same elongated, antlered figures we'd seen in the paintings, but rendered in such detail that they seemed almost alive. "This is impossible," Sarah whispered. "These stones, they're not native to this area. How did they get them down here?" I opened my mouth to reply, but the words died in my throat as a sound echoed through the chamber. A low, rhythmic chanting, so faint I thought I might be imagining it. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom and Sarah nodded, their faces pale in the harsh light of the headlamps. The chanting grew louder, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A cold wind whipped through the chamber, carrying with it that same musty animal smell, stronger now, almost overpowering. "We need to leave," I said, fighting to keep the panic out of my voice. Now, we turned to go, but in the shifting shadows cast by our lights, the passage we'd come through was nowhere to be seen. We were trapped. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and suddenly the standing stones began to glow with an eerie green light. In the sickly illumination, I saw movement at the edge of the chamber. Tall, impossibly thin figures emerged from the shadows, their antlered heads bowed as they continued their otherworldly song. "Oh God," Sarah choked out. "They're real. The Wendigo. They're real." I'd heard the legends, of course. The Algonquin tales of cannibalistic spirits, of humans transformed by greed and hunger into monstrous creatures. But I'd never believed them, until now. The Wendigo approached slowly, their movements jerky and unnatural. Up close, I could see that their skin was stretched tight over their skeletal frames, their eyes sunken and glowing with an unholy hunger. We huddled together in the center of the stone circle, our backs pressed against the cold, unyielding rock. I fumbled for my satellite phone, praying for a signal, for some way to call for help, but the screen remained stubbornly dark. The Wendigo circled us, their chanting growing louder, more frenzied. The air in the chamber seemed to thicken, making it hard to breathe. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. "Elena!" Tom's voice cut through the haze of terror. "The carvings! Look at the carvings!" I forced myself to focus on the nearest standing stone. The carvings there were shifting, changing before my eyes. They showed a group of people. Us, I realized with a jolt, standing in the center of the circle. And then, to my horror, I saw our carved counterparts begin to change, their bodies elongating, antlers sprouting from their heads. "Yuan, it's a transformation ritual," I gasped. "They're trying to turn us into them." As if in response to my words, the Wendigo's chanting reached a crescendo. The green light pulsed, brighter and brighter, until it was all I could see. I felt a searing pain in my head, as if something was trying to claw its way out from the inside. I don't know how long we stood there, trapped in that nightmare. Time seemed to lose all meaning. But just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, when I felt my very humanity slipping away, something changed. A new sound cut through the Wendigo's chant, a long, mournful howl. Wolf. No, too deep, too primal. The Wendigo faltered, their song stuttering to a halt. In the sudden silence, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something massive moving through the cave system towards us. The Wendigo scattered, melting back into the shadows with inhuman speed. The green light faded, plunging us back into darkness broken only by our flickering headlamps. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking. Before I could answer, a roar shook the chamber so loud it made my teeth rattle, and then, illuminated in the beam of my headlamp, I saw it. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur. But it wasn't a bear, wasn't any animal I could name. It stood on 2 legs, its body a twisted amalgamation of wolf and man. Its snout was long, filled with teeth that gleamed in the artificial light, and its eyes, God, its eyes burned with an intelligence that was terrifyingly human. For a moment, we all stood frozen. Us, the Wendigo lurking in the shadows, and this new, impossible creature. Then, with a speed that defied its size, the beast charged. But it wasn't charging at us. It tore into the Wendigo, its massive claws rending flesh from bone. The Wendigo fought back, their skeletal forms belying an inhuman strength, but they were no match for this new monster. In the chaos, I felt a hand grab my arm. It was Tom, pulling me towards a narrow crevice in the chamber wall. "Come on!" he shouted. "This is our chance." We squeezed through the opening, the sounds of the battle fading behind us. We ran blindly through twisting passages, our only goal to put as much distance between us and that chamber of horrors as possible. I don't know how long we ran, or how we found our way back to the surface. The storm was in full force when we emerged, the wind and rain feeling almost welcoming after the nightmare we'd left behind. We made it back to civilization, but our story was met with disbelief and concern for our mental health. The cave system was searched, but no trace was found of the standing stones, the Wendigo, or the beast that had saved us. Sometimes I wonder if it was all a hallucination, some shared delusion brought on by cave gases or oxygen deprivation. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, a flash of inhuman hunger in my eyes, the ghost of antlers sprouting from my skull, and I know the Wendigo are real, and they're still out there, waiting in the dark places of the world. As for the creature that saved us, I don't know what it was, but I fear we've only scratched the surface of the mysteries and monsters that lurk in the shadows of our world. And sometimes, on dark, stormy nights, I swear I can hear that chanting again, calling me back to the depths of the earth, back to a transformation left unfinished. And I wonder, how long can I resist its call? Story 15. I had always considered myself unshakable. After nearly a decade as a park ranger, I'd seen it all: lost hikers, rabid animals, freak accidents, and even the occasional ghost story from campers trying to scare each other around the fire. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what happened that night. It was a typical late fall evening, crisp and cold. The wind howled through the treetops, rustling the last stubborn leaves clinging to the branches. My shift had just started, and I had settled into my routine patrol through the park's winding trails. Being the only ranger on duty that night wasn't unusual. It was the off-season, and most campers had packed up and left before the real cold set in. The forest felt especially quiet, the kind of quiet that almost hums in your ears, making every sound seem louder. I was driving the old park-issued truck down the narrow dirt road that cut through the denser part of the woods. The headlights sliced through the darkness, illuminating the endless tunnel of trees ahead of me. I scanned the sides of the road for any signs of movement, my eyes accustomed to catching glimpses of deer or smaller critters darting through the underbrush. But tonight, there was nothing. Just darkness and the occasional flutter of shadows as branches swayed in the wind. It wasn't long before I felt the hairs on the back of my neck prick up. I slowed the truck to a crawl, trying to pinpoint the source of my discomfort. Something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the woods felt different, almost like they were holding their breath. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease. Get it together," I muttered to myself, tightening my grip on the steering wheel. A noise caught my attention, something faint, almost lost in the rustle of leaves. I killed the engine, plunging the truck into an eerie silence. I sat there, my eyes darting around the forest beyond the windshield, my ears straining to pick up the sound again. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight from the seat beside me and opened the truck door. The cold air rushed in, biting at my face and hands. I hesitated, listening for the growl again. My rational mind was screaming that it was just a bear or maybe a wolf, but deep down, some primal part of me knew it was neither. Slowly I stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel road. I swept the flashlight across the tree line. The beam was powerful, cutting through the dark like a knife, but the forest swallowed up the light just a few yards in. I scanned left to right, my breath clouding in the cold air as I strained to see any movement. The forest was silent again, unnervingly so. Not even a single chirp from the crickets that usually filled the night. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something moving. I turned quickly, my flashlight struggling to catch up. For a brief second, I saw it, a large, shadowy figure slipping between the trees with unnatural speed. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. It was gone just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me staring at nothing but darkness and tangled branches. My mind raced. It had been on two legs, I was sure of it, but it was too big, too fast to be a person. I felt my pulse quicken, adrenaline flooding my veins. I gritted my teeth, trying to rationalize what I had just seen. "Must be a trick of the light," I whispered to myself, though I knew I was lying. I couldn't shake the image of that shadowy form. I walked a few steps toward the spot where I'd seen the movement, every muscle in my body tense. My flashlight beam flickered as it swept the underbrush, casting eerie, dancing shadows. I called out, my voice firm, though my heart hammered in my chest. "Hello? Anyone out there?" Silence. I waited, my breath caught in my throat, listening intently, nothing but the distant whisper of the wind. I took another step forward, then another, my boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. I was almost at the edge of the trees when I heard the growl again, louder this time, closer. It vibrated through the air, so deep and guttural that I felt it in my bones. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to hold my ground, shining the flashlight into the dark forest, and then it stepped into the beam of light. My stomach dropped. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to drink in the light. It stood on two legs, its hunched posture giving it an almost human-like silhouette. But the head, God, the head was all wrong. It was elongated, like that of a wolf with a snout filled with glistening fangs. Its eyes, reflecting the beam of my flashlight, glowed an eerie yellow, locked onto me with an unnerving intelligence. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The creature stared at me, its lips curling back to reveal more of those sharp teeth. A low growl rumbled from its chest, reverberating through the air. I felt an icy grip of terror seize me, pinning me to the spot. This was no bear, no wolf. This was something else, something that shouldn't exist outside of nightmares. Then it took a step forward. I snapped out of my paralysis and stumbled back, almost tripping over my own feet. My flashlight shook in my hand, the beam jerking wildly as I tried to keep it trained on the creature. I fumbled for the radio on my belt, my fingers numb and clumsy with fear. "Base, this is Ranger Cole." My voice cracked as I glanced up and realized the creature was still moving toward me, slow and deliberate, as if it enjoyed my terror. "I've got a situation out here. I need backup now." The radio crackled with static. Then a voice responded, "Copy, Ranger Cole." What's your location? I managed to blurt out my position, never taking my eyes off the creature. It was closer now, only a dozen feet away. I could see its breath fogging in the cold night air, could smell the rank odor of wet fur and something metallic. Blood. My hands shook violently, my heart hammering against my ribs as I braced myself for whatever came next. It paused, head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread, as if this thing was toying with me. It bared its teeth in what almost looked like a grin, the muscles around its mouth twitching. I took another step back, my foot landing on a dry branch that snapped with a deafening crack. The creature lunged. I screamed, stumbling back and throwing my arms up instinctively. I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly across the ground, casting crazed shadows around us. For a heartbeat, I thought it was over, my mind filled with flashes of teeth, claws, and darkness. But then, just as quickly as it had lunged, it stopped. It stood there, its chest heaving, its eyes still fixed on me. Slowly, almost casually, it backed away, its gaze never breaking from mine. I stood there, gasping for breath, unable to move, unable to process what was happening. The creature receded into the darkness, slipping silently between the trees until it vanished completely. I fell to my knees, trembling uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I fumbled for the flashlight, grabbing it with shaking hands, and shined it toward the spot where it had disappeared. Nothing. Just darkness and the whispering of the wind through the trees. The radio on my belt crackled. "Ranger Cole, are you there? What's the situation?" I swallowed hard, trying to find my voice. It's gone," I managed to stammer, my throat dry. I don't know what it was, but it's gone. I got back to my feet, my legs unsteady beneath me, and stumbled back to the truck. I climbed in, locking the doors behind me, and sat there for a long moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. It had let me go. Why? What was it? With a shaking hand, I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, the sound startling me back to reality. I drove back to the station in a daze, my eyes constantly flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those glowing yellow eyes following me. That night changed me. It shattered my belief in what was possible, in what should exist. Even now, when I patrol the park, I can feel it sometimes, the sensation of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the edges of the light. And on those nights, I make sure to finish my patrols early and get the hell out of those woods before darkness falls. Story 16. The woods have a way of playing tricks on you. During the day, they seem inviting, peaceful even. But when the sun dips below the horizon, the forest changes. Shadows stretch out and twist into strange shapes, and the noises, those damn noises, take on an entirely different tone. It was a feeling I had grown familiar with after years of hiking and camping, yet nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened that day. It started as a typical weekend hike. My buddy Mark and I were both amateur nature photographers, always looking for hidden trails and spots where wildlife would be abundant. We had come across an old, overgrown trail in a remote section of the national park a few months prior and had been itching to explore it further. So, on this chilly fall morning, we set out with our gear strapped to our backs and the usual sense of excitement that came with the promise of adventure. We hiked for hours, winding our way through thick underbrush and dense clusters of trees. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched underfoot, the smell of damp earth filling our noses. At some point, Mark spotted something just off the trail, half hidden by a thicket of shrubs. "Hey, check this out," he called, pointing ahead. I pushed through the foliage and found myself standing in front of a large, battered trail cam mounted to a tree. It looked old, the kind of outdated model you'd expect to find at a ranger station's lost and found. Its metal casing was rusted, and the lens was cracked, but the power light was still blinking faintly. Huh, someone must have forgotten this here, I said, reaching out to inspect it. Wonder if it still works. Mark shrugged. Only one way to find out. He grabbed the camera and fiddled with the buttons until a small screen flickered to life. Looks like there's a memory card in here. We should check it out. A part of me was curious, maybe even a little excited. Trail cams often captured the kind of wildlife encounters you rarely saw in person. Deer, bears, sometimes even wolves. It was like finding a window into the secret life of the forest. So we decided to take the camera with us. It felt like we were carrying a piece of the wood's history, a relic that had silently recorded whatever had passed by for God knows how long. As the afternoon wore on, we finished our hike and made our way back to the campsite. The sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, but we had one thing on our minds: the footage. We set up camp, built a small fire, and then pulled out the camera. Using an adapter, we inserted the memory card into my laptop and opened the folder containing the images. At first, it was exactly what we expected. A series of photos taken at various times of the day. Deer, raccoons, foxes, even a bear passing by. We scrolled through them, commenting and laughing at some of the more amusing captures, like a deer staring directly into the lens with wide, clueless eyes. But then, things started to get strange. "Wait, go back," Mark said, leaning in closer to the screen. "Did you see that?" I clicked back a few frames until I reached the one he was talking about. My heart skipped a beat. The image was blurry, taken at night, but there was something in the background, a shape. It was tall, hunched over, with long limbs and what looked like a misshapen head. My brain struggled to make sense of it. "Probably just some trick of the light," I muttered, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. Mark wasn't convinced. He motioned for me to keep scrolling. The next few images were similar, but the shape seemed to be moving. It was coming closer to the camera with each shot, becoming more defined. By the fifth image, I could see it clearly, or at least as clearly as the camera's grainy night vision allowed. A tall figure, almost human in shape but far too large, with limbs that seemed too long and bent at unnatural angles. Its eyes were pinpoints of light reflecting off the camera's flash, and its mouth was open in what looked like a twisted, toothy grin. "What the hell is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I felt a chill run down my spine as I continued scrolling through the images. The thing got closer in each frame, its movements captured in eerie stop motion. It was moving through the trees, always at the edge of the frame, almost as if it knew exactly where the camera was and was avoiding it. Then, in the final shot, it was right up against the camera. I gasped. The creature was staring directly into the lens, its eyes reflecting the light in an unsettling glow. Its face was a distorted mess of features, eyes too large, mouth too wide, with a tangle of hair or fur framing its grotesque head. But what made my blood run cold was the expression. It looked angry, yet somehow amused, like it had been playing a game and had finally won. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice shaky. "Now?" Mark nodded, his eyes glued to the screen. "Yeah, yet you're right." I quickly shut the laptop and stood up, my heart pounding. The forest around us had grown eerily silent, as if it was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the tree line, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating nothing but shadows and the faint outlines of branches swaying in the wind. But something felt wrong, like we were being watched. We started packing up, moving as fast as our trembling hands allowed. The fire crackled and hissed beside us, but it provided little comfort against the icy fear creeping into my bones. As I was shoving gear into my backpack, I heard it, a low, guttural growl from somewhere beyond the trees. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, not daring to move. Mark nodded, his eyes wide. "It's out there." We stood motionless, straining to hear over the blood rushing in our ears. Then from the darkness came the sound of branches snapping, slow, deliberate. Something was moving toward us. "Grab the camera," Mark hissed. "We need to go." I snatched the trail cam, stuffing it into my pack. We doused the fire with what little water we had left and swung our packs over our shoulders. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to move cautiously, not wanting to draw its attention if it hadn't already zeroed in on us. We started walking, trying to keep our steps as quiet as possible, but the forest floor was littered with dry leaves and twigs. Every crackle underfoot sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by a rustling noise that seemed to circle around us. Panic clawed at my chest. "Go faster," I urged, pushing Mark forward. We broke into a jog, stumbling over roots and rocks as we made our way back toward the main trail. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that twisted face emerging from the shadows. As we neared the trailhead, the noises intensified. Whatever was out there was moving faster now, keeping pace with us. The trees on either side of the trail swayed unnaturally, as if something enormous was pushing through them. I could feel the ground vibrate beneath my feet, each thud matching the pounding of my heart. "Come on, come on!" Mark yelled, sprinting ahead of me. I pushed myself harder, adrenaline surging through my veins. The trailhead was just up ahead, the faint glimmer of our truck's headlights visible in the distance. Safety, just a little farther. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flash of movement to my left. I turned my head, and there it was, running parallel to us through the trees. It was massive, its limbs moving in a grotesque, fluid motion that made my stomach twist. Its eyes glowed with that same eerie light as in the photos, locking onto me as it ran. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I went sprawling forward, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot up my arm, but I barely registered it. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, my eyes locked on the creature as it moved toward me. "Get up!" Mark screamed from up ahead. "Get to the truck!" I didn't need to be told twice. I forced myself upright and sprinted the last few yards to the truck. Mark was already inside, the engine roaring to life. I yanked the passenger door open and threw myself in, slamming it shut just as the creature broke through the tree line. It stopped at the edge of the road, standing there, watching us. Its chest heaved with each breath, its eyes burning into mine. And then, to my horror, it raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at me. I felt a wave of nausea and terror wash over me. "Go!" I yelled, and Mark floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, gravel spraying from under the tires as we sped away, leaving the creature standing in the dust. We didn't stop until we were miles away, the forest far behind us. Only then did we pull over, panting and shaking, our eyes darting to the woods around us as if expecting it to appear at any moment. I reached into my pack and pulled out the trail cam, my hands trembling. "Adi, what the hell was that?" I muttered, more to myself than to Mark. He didn't answer. He just stared ahead, his face pale. I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that had been watching, waiting, and for some reason it had chosen us. We never went back to that trail. We left the trail cam on the side of the road that night and drove away without looking back. But every now and then, I catch myself thinking about those images, about those glowing eyes and that twisted, mocking grin. And I wonder if it's still out there, watching from the shadows, waiting for someone else to find it. Story 17. The forest at night has its own language, a kind of sinister whisper carried on the wind. It can trick you into believing you're safe when you're not. I had learned this the hard way. I still remember that night like a bad dream, replaying it over and over in my mind, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was some explanation that didn't involve the thing I saw. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. I had found a remote spot deep in the woods, a perfect clearing tucked away from the main trails. Just me, my tent, and a weekend of peace and quiet. I set up camp by early afternoon, pitched my tent, and gathered some firewood, feeling the satisfaction of solitude settle in. By dusk, the sky had darkened to a deep blue, and a canopy of stars began to reveal itself above the towering pines. I had a small fire going, its warmth fighting off the growing chill in the air. Dinner was simple, just a can of beans heated over the flames, but I was content. It was one of those nights when everything felt right. The quiet of the forest, the crackle of the fire, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. It felt like the world had shrunk down to just me and this little patch of earth. I watched the flames dance, the shadows flickering around me, and I let out a deep, relaxed sigh. I should have paid more attention to the sounds. In hindsight, there was a stillness that had settled in, an unnerving silence. No chirping of crickets, no rustling of small animals in the brush. The air was so quiet, it was almost as if the forest itself was holding its breath, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I banked the fire and crawled into my tent, zipping up the flap to seal out the cold. I laid there for a while, listening to the faint rustling of the trees, the gentle sway of branches above me. It was calming, almost hypnotic. Before long, I drifted off, cocooned in my sleeping bag. Sometime later, I woke up with a start. At first, I couldn't tell why. My heart was pounding, my mouth dry. I lay there, ears straining, trying to catch any noise that might have pulled me from sleep. For a moment, there was nothing but the muffled thump of my heartbeat in my ears. Then I heard it, a dragging sound, soft but unmistakable, coming from outside the tent. My blood ran cold. It was slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled through the dirt. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed. As I listened, the sound stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in its wake. I reached for my flashlight, my hands trembling slightly as I clicked it on. The light cast a narrow beam inside the tent, illuminating the faint outlines of my backpack, my boots, and the tent's thin fabric walls. I turned my head slowly, listening intently for any sign of movement outside. Nothing, just that heavy, suffocating quiet. I waited for what felt like hours, but could have been mere minutes, the flashlight gripped tightly in my hand. Maybe it was just a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon rummaging through my things. I needed to check, to put my mind at ease. With a deep breath, I moved the flashlight toward the tent's zipper. The sound of it seemed to echo in the quiet night. I peeled back the flap just enough to peek out. The fire was now just glowing embers, casting faint shadows around the campsite. I scanned the area, swinging the beam of the flashlight left to right. My eyes caught on my backpack, which lay on the ground, its contents scattered. But that wasn't what made my stomach twist into a knot. Next to the pack, the dirt was disturbed, grooved as if something had been dragged through it. My breath hitched, and I instinctively pulled back into the tent, zipping the flap up quickly. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears, my skin prickling with a cold sweat. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Animals didn't move with that kind of purpose. Just as I was trying to calm my racing thoughts, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. A scratching sound, low and scraping, right next to the tent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Whatever it was inches away, separated only by a thin layer of fabric. The scratching stopped, followed by a deep, raspy breath that sent a wave of terror crashing over me. I had to get out of here. I thought about grabbing the hatchet I had left outside with the firewood, but that meant unzipping the tent, exposing myself to whatever was lurking just beyond. The idea made my skin crawl. As I sat there, paralyzed with fear, I felt a pressure on the tent wall to my left. I turned, the flashlight beam shaking as I aimed it at the source. The fabric bulged inward, the imprint of a large hand, no, not a hand, a paw, pressing against it. It was massive, with thick, elongated fingers ending in claws that scraped against the nylon material. I bit back a scream, feeling my entire body go rigid. The paw slid across the tent, making a slow, deliberate circle around me, as if feeling out its prey. I could hear its breath, deep and ragged, so close I could almost feel it. I clamped a hand over my mouth, terrified that even the sound of my breathing would give me away. Then it stopped. The pressure against the tent vanished, leaving behind a stark silence. I waited, muscles tensed, every nerve on edge, expecting it to come crashing in at any moment. But instead, I heard movement, slow, deliberate steps circling the tent. It was pacing around me, and I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see it. I didn't dare move. My mind raced with images of what might be out there. A bear, a wolf, something worse. The steps stopped directly in front of the tent flap, and I heard a low, growling noise. It was unlike anything I had ever heard before, almost a mix of a snarl and a hiss, filled with a chilling intelligence that set my teeth on edge. Suddenly, the flap shook violently, the zipper rattling as if something was testing it. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the flashlight like it was the only thing keeping me alive. The shaking continued, then abruptly stopped. Silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. My heart hammered in my chest, and sweat trickled down the back of my neck. Minutes stretched on like hours. Then, from outside, I heard a low, guttural growl, followed by the sound of something heavy moving away. It dragged itself back into the forest, the noise gradually fading into the distance. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting. When I finally summoned the courage to move, I reached out and slowly unzipped the flap, just enough to peer outside. The campsite was a mess. My backpack lay torn open, clothes and supplies scattered across the dirt. Deep gouges marked the ground leading into the tree line. Whatever had been out there, it was gone. For now. My hands shook as I crawled out of the tent, flashlight cutting through the darkness. I stumbled to the fire pit, grabbing the hatchet with trembling fingers. I had to get out of here, had to pack up and leave before it came back. I hurriedly stuffed what I could into my backpack, leaving most of my things behind. I couldn't risk taking the time to gather everything. With my pack slung over one shoulder and the hatchet in hand, I moved quickly toward the path that led back to my car. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a dark shape lurching out of the woods. The walk back was a blur, my body moving on autopilot, driven by pure fear. I reached the car, threw my gear into the back seat, and fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to fit the key into the lock. I climbed inside, slammed the door shut, and locked it, my chest heaving with panic. For a long moment, I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring out into the darkness of the forest. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and I sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. The headlights carved out a narrow path through the trees, and for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope. I was getting out, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that somewhere out there in the darkness, it was still stalking me. The imprint of that clawed paw on my tent was burned into my memory, a haunting reminder of what lurked in the woods. I don't go camping alone anymore. Sometimes, when I lie awake at night, I can still hear the sound of that low, rasping breath and the dragging noise outside my tent, and I wonder, how long until it finds me again? Story 18. There's something about caves that unnerves me. The way darkness seems to spill out of them like a living thing. Yet that didn't stop me and my friend Jake from exploring every cave we came across during our hikes. We were drawn to the mystery of them, the thrill of stepping into places where few had ventured, but that thrill turned into a living nightmare the day we found that cave. I still remember the sound, the howl that echoed through those tunnels, and the way it crawled under my skin like a parasite, refusing to leave. It was a cold, overcast morning, the kind that blankets the forest in a dull, grey light. Jake and I were hiking an isolated trail deep in the mountains, one we hadn't explored before. We were a few miles in when we stumbled upon a rocky outcrop. Hidden behind a tangle of roots and moss was a cave entrance, a black gash in the hillside. Jake was the first to notice it. "Check it out, man. Looks like we found our next adventure," he said, grinning and wiping the sweat off his brow. I hesitated, staring into the cave's maw. It was darker than the others we'd explored. Its entrance almost seemed to swallow the light around it. My stomach knotted with a sense of unease that I quickly shoved aside. "Yeah, sure," I replied, forcing a grin. "Let's see what's in there." We pulled out our flashlights and made our way inside, ducking under low-hanging rocks. The air grew cooler and thicker with each step, carrying the damp scent of earth and something else, something faintly rotten. I told myself it was probably just the smell of decaying plant matter, but a part of me wasn't so sure. The deeper we went, the narrower the cave became. The light from the entrance faded until it was just the thin beams of our flashlights cutting through the dark. Our footsteps echoed, a rhythmic crunch of gravel underfoot that sounded unnervingly loud in the silence. I tried to keep my breathing steady, but each inhale seemed to carry the cold, musty air deeper into my lungs. "Whoa!" Jake muttered up ahead, his flashlight beam catching on something. I moved closer, and my blood went cold. There, etched into the rocky walls, were symbols, strange, twisting patterns that didn't look like any cave art I'd ever seen. They were crudely carved, jagged lines that almost seemed to vibrate in the dim light. "What do you think they mean?" I asked, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. Jake shrugged, squatting down to inspect them. "I don't know, man. Maybe some ancient stuff. Or just some random graffiti." He laughed, but it sounded forced, the tension creeping into his voice. I reached out to touch one of the symbols, but something held me back, a primal instinct screaming at me not to. I pulled my hand away and turned my flashlight further into the cave. That's when I noticed the bones. At first, I thought they were just rocks, but as we got closer, I saw them for what they were, animal bones, scattered and broken, some still covered in scraps of dried, leathery skin. I felt a wave of nausea. "What the hell?" I muttered, backing away. Jake stood, frowning as he looked at the scattered remains. "This isn't right," he said. For once, he sounded as uneasy as I felt. "We should get out of here." I nodded, relief washing over me. "Yeah, let's go." We turned to leave, moving back toward the entrance as fast as we could without breaking into a run. My heart pounded in my chest, and I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, avoiding the sight of the bones and those damn symbols. But just as we neared the cave's mouth, a sound stopped us dead in our tracks. A howl. It was distant at first, a low, mournful wail that echoed through the tunnels. I felt every hair on my body stand on end. It wasn't like any animal sound I'd ever heard. There was something almost human about it, like a twisted mix of a scream and a cry. Jake turned to me, his face pale in the dim light. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. I nodded, unable to speak. The howl came again, this time louder, reverberating through the cave. It was getting closer. I shone my flashlight back into the darkness, my hand trembling. For a split second I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting against the rocks. "Run!" I croaked, grabbing Jake's arm and pulling him toward the entrance. We bolted, our footsteps a frantic scuffle of gravel and dirt. The cave seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in around us like a living thing. The howl rose to a deafening pitch, echoing off the walls, chasing us as we ran. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel something behind us, something large and fast. Finally, we burst out of the cave, stumbling into the cold light of the forest. We didn't stop. We kept running, our breath ragged and our legs burning as we pushed through the underbrush. I could hear the snapping of branches behind us, a crashing noise that made my blood run cold. It was following us. "Keep going!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "Don't stop!" We tore through the forest, ducking under low branches and leaping over roots. The howling grew fainter, but I didn't slow down. My instinct screamed at me to get as far away from that cave as possible. I glanced over my shoulder and saw nothing but trees and shadows, yet the feeling of being hunted didn't fade. After what felt like hours, we broke through the tree line and onto the main trail. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, my chest heaving. Jake fell beside me, his face slick with sweat, eyes wide and wild. "What the hell was that?" he panted, looking back toward the forest with fear in his eyes. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind was racing, replaying the events in the cave, the sound of that unearthly howl. I had no answers, only a gut-wrenching certainty that whatever had made that noise was still out there. We sat there for a while, trying to calm our racing hearts, our ears straining for any sign of pursuit, but the forest had returned to its eerie silence, the only sound the wind rustling through the leaves. I finally managed to get to my feet, offering a hand to Jake. "We need to get back to the car," I said, my voice shaky, "and we're not coming back here ever." Jake nodded, his face still pale. We walked quickly, every creak of a branch and rustle of leaves setting our nerves on edge. The forest that had once felt so familiar now seemed foreign, hostile. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we neared the parking lot, relief started to seep in. The sight of the car was a lifeline, a promise of safety. We practically ran the last few yards, throwing ourselves into the vehicle and slamming the doors shut. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as we sped down the narrow road. The drive back was a blur. Neither of us spoke, too wrapped up in our own thoughts, our own fear. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurching out of the trees, something with glowing eyes and a twisted, hungry grin, but the road remained empty. It wasn't until we were miles away, the forest far behind us, that I allowed myself to breathe. My hands were still shaking on the wheel, my mind reeling with what had just happened. Jake sat in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window. "What do you think it was?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "I don't know," I admitted, my stomach churning. "But whatever it wasn't human." We never spoke of that cave again. We never went back to that part of the forest either. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed with the lights off, I think I can hear it, the faint echo of that howl, the sound of something ancient and hungry lurking just beyond the edge of the light. And I know, deep down, that it's still out there, waiting. Story 19. The forest can play tricks on you. It lures you in with its beauty, the whispering leaves and sun-dappled paths, making you believe it's a world of serenity. But sometimes it changes, like it did that day. I can still hear the footsteps, the ones that followed me so closely, matching every move, every breath I took. They weren't mine, and that realization was the most terrifying part of all. I'd set out early that morning, looking forward to a day of solitude on the trail. Hiking had always been my escape, a way to leave behind the stress of work and life in general. I picked one of the more remote trails this time, a rarely used path that wound deep through the national forest. I had planned a long hike, one that would take me to a secluded clearing I'd read about in an old trail guide. There was supposed to be a beautiful stream there, a place untouched by the usual crowd of weekend hikers. The first few hours were bliss. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and the rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth. My boots crunched on the dry leaves, and I felt that familiar sense of peace that only the woods could bring. I hiked along, whistling to myself and occasionally stopping to take pictures of the sunlight streaming through the canopy. By noon, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, the trail narrower. It wasn't exactly overgrown, but it was clear that this part of the forest didn't see many visitors. I felt a thrill at the thought. This was what I had come for, after all, a true escape into nature. As I ventured deeper, the sounds of the forest shifted, the bird song quieted, replaced by the creaking of branches swaying in the wind. It was around this time that I first noticed it, an extra set of footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining things. The sound was faint, barely audible over my own footfalls. I paused, straining to listen. Silence. I glanced around, scanning the trees, expecting to see another hiker coming up behind me. Nothing, just the forest, silent and still. I shook off the unease and kept moving, brushing it off as my imagination. But the footsteps came back. They started again the moment I resumed walking, this time clearer, heavier. I stopped suddenly, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps stopped too, a fraction of a second after mine. My heart began to pound as I turned around, shining my eyes into the dense woods, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing, only shadows and leaves shifting gently in the breeze. "Hello?" I called out, my voice unnaturally loud in the quiet. It echoed briefly, then faded away into the forest. No reply. I stood there for a moment, feeling a strange prickle on the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, a deer maybe, curious about the intruder in its territory. That explanation made sense, right? It had to be. With a shaky breath, I continued down the trail. I walked a bit faster this time, my ears on high alert for the sound of those footsteps. And sure enough, they returned, mirroring my pace. I picked up speed, moving almost at a jog now, but the steps behind me matched mine perfectly. It was as though whoever, or whatever it was, wanted me to know it was there. I stopped abruptly again, my heart hammering in my chest. The forest fell silent, and so did the footsteps. I scanned the trees, a creeping sense of dread starting to wash over me. There was something out there, something that was playing with me. I took a few steps to the left, deliberately slow, listening intently. Sure enough, a faint crunch of leaves echoed my movement. I swallowed hard, gripping the straps of my backpack. "Okay, this isn't funny," I called out, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "If someone's out there, show yourself." Silence. I stood frozen, my ears straining to pick up even the faintest noise. Then from somewhere behind me, I heard it. A low, almost inaudible chuckle. My blood ran cold. It was a sound that didn't belong here, something that shouldn't have been human but was trying to mimic one. Panic surged through me. I bolted, sprinting down the trail, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But I didn't need to hear to know that the footsteps were following. They thudded behind me, heavy and fast, crashing through the underbrush. I dared a glance over my shoulder, but all I saw were shadows darting between the trees, moving with a speed that made my stomach drop. I ran faster, lungs burning, legs screaming in protest. My mind raced with 100 fragmented thoughts. What was behind me? How long had it been following? And most terrifying of all, why hadn't I seen it yet? The trail twisted sharply to the right, and I skidded around the corner, nearly losing my balance. I stumbled into a small clearing, breathing hard, and finally dared to stop. My chest heaved as I turned to face the trail behind me, my eyes wide with fear. Nothing. The path was empty. I scanned the tree line, my breath fogging in the chilly air. The forest was unnervingly still, the quiet almost deafening. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I forced myself to keep my eyes on the woods. Whatever was out there, it was hiding now, watching. I took a few cautious steps backward, never taking my eyes off the trees. Then, from the shadows, something moved. It was subtle at first, just a slight shift among the branches, but then I saw it, a shape, tall and hunched, blending into the forest. It stood just beyond the clearing, partially obscured by the shadows, its form almost wrong. It was as if it was trying to mimic a human shape, but failing in a grotesque way. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice barely more than a whisper. It didn't answer, it didn't need to. I could feel its gaze on me, piercing through the dimness. My pulse quickened, a primal fear gripping my insides. It moved again, taking a single step forward, the sound of its footfall heavy and deliberate. That was all I needed. I turned and ran, adrenaline surging through my veins. I tore through the forest, no longer caring about the trail. Branches whipped at my face, the underbrush clawing at my legs, but I didn't stop. I had to get away. I had to get out of those woods. The footsteps thundered behind me, gaining speed, growing louder. They were right on my heels, so close I could almost feel their vibrations in the ground. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my vision blurring from the sheer effort. Up ahead, I saw a break in the trees. Sunlight, the trailhead. I threw myself toward it, my legs screaming in protest. I burst out of the forest, stumbling onto the dirt road where my car was parked. I practically dove for the door, fumbling with the keys as my hands shook violently. I got it open, jumped inside, and slammed the door shut, locking it instantly. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat there, gasping for breath. Slowly, I turned to look back at the forest. The tree line was dark, shadows pooling between the trees. And there, just at the edge, I saw it, a figure, standing motionless, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, with limbs that seemed too long, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was staring at me, watching. I forced myself to tear my eyes away, started the car, and floored the gas pedal. The tires spun on the dirt for a split second before gripping, sending me speeding away from that place. It wasn't until I was miles down the road that I dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The forest was far behind me, nothing but a blur of green and grey, but I could still hear the echo of those footsteps in my mind, that low, unsettling chuckle that didn't belong in the natural world. I haven't been back to those woods since. I still hike, but I stick to well-known trails now, places where people are always nearby. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the forest, I swear I can hear it, the sound of footsteps matching mine, just out of sight. And I wonder if one day I'll see that figure again. Story 20. The old cabin sat on the ridge like a wound on the forest, a reminder that some places are better left forgotten. I didn't want to go in. Everything in my gut told me to keep walking, to pretend I'd never seen it. But curiosity can be a dangerous thing, especially when you're out in the wilderness with nothing but a flashlight and a few friends for company. And that night, curiosity led us straight into a nightmare. We'd been hiking all day, trying to make it to the summit before sunset. It was me, Sam, and Chris, my best friends since college, adventure buddies who would rather spend their weekends exploring the backwoods than sitting at home. We'd planned this trip for weeks, aiming to find some peace and solitude out here in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no people, just the sounds of nature and our own footsteps crunching through the leaves. As dusk approached, we knew we needed to set up camp for the night. That's when we saw it, a weather-beaten structure barely visible through the trees, its roof sagging under a thick mat of moss. "Whoa, is that a cabin?" Chris asked, squinting through the undergrowth. "Looks like it," Sam replied, sounding as surprised as I felt. I didn't know there were any buildings out here. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I looked at the cabin. It was old, ancient even, with a front porch that sagged under its own weight and windows clouded over with grime. The whole place radiated an air of abandonment, of something long forgotten. Part of me wanted to keep walking, to find a clearing somewhere else to set up our tents, but then Sam grinned, that familiar glint of adventure sparking in his eyes. "Let's check it out," he said, already making his way through the brush toward the cabin. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" I called after him, feeling a pang of unease. "We don't know what's inside." Chris laughed, slinging his pack over his shoulder. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen? It's just an old cabin, could be a cool place to camp for the night." Reluctantly, I followed them. The closer we got, the more the cabin loomed over us, its wooden walls blackened with age and rot. A faint odor wafted toward me, a mix of damp earth and something metallic. My stomach churned, but I kept moving, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread. Sam was the first to reach the porch, stepping up cautiously as the wood creaked under his weight. "Well, here we are," he said, pushing the door open with a loud groan. The interior was cloaked in darkness, the air thick with the smell of mildew. I hesitated at the doorway, shining my flashlight inside. The beam illuminated a small room, empty except for a broken table and what looked like the remains of a fireplace against the far wall. The walls were lined with deep, jagged scratches, as if something with claws had scraped at them over and over. My breath caught in my throat, and I had to force myself to step inside. "Looks cozy," Chris joked, but I could hear the edge of unease in his voice. "Yeah, real cozy," I muttered, glancing around. "Let's just get a fire going and call it a night." We set up our sleeping bags near the fireplace, hoping to ward off the chill that had settled in the room. Sam managed to get a small fire going with some dry wood he found in a corner. The flickering light cast eerie shadows across the walls, making the scratches look like they were moving. As we sat there, eating dinner from our packs, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see something watching us from the dark forest outside. Chris and Sam were talking, but I barely heard them. My attention fixated on the faint noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling in the wind. "Did you hear that?" I interrupted, holding up a hand to silence them. Chris raised an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "That sound outside," I said, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft scraping, like something dragging across the porch. My heart skipped a beat. "It's probably just an animal," Sam said dismissively, though his eyes darted toward the door. "These old cabins attract all sorts of critters." I nodded, trying to convince myself he was right, but deep down, I knew something was off. The forest had grown deathly quiet, the kind of silence that screams danger. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, feeling a knot of fear settle in my stomach. Minutes passed, each one stretching into an eternity. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the room, and I found myself staring at the doorway, my nerves fraying with every second. Then it happened. A loud bang rattled the door, followed by a heavy scraping noise that made my blood run cold. Chris jumped to his feet, eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. I shined the flashlight toward the door, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness beyond it. The banging continued, rhythmic and deliberate, each thud echoing through the cabin. It wasn't random, it was as if something or someone was testing the door, pushing against it, trying to get inside. I felt my pulse quicken, my instincts screaming at me to run. Sam moved slowly toward the door, holding up a hand to quiet us. "Stay here," he mouthed, his face pale in the flickering light. "Are you crazy?" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "We don't know what's out there." He shook me off, taking a deep breath. "We need to know what it is. We can't just sit here and wait." Reluctantly, I let him go, my heart hammering in my chest. Sam reached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. He glanced back at us, then nodded once before yanking it open. A gust of cold air rushed into the room, snuffing out the fire. For a split second, I saw nothing but darkness, my flashlight beam cutting through the void. Then something moved, a shape, hunched and massive, just beyond the porch. It shifted, its outline blurring in the dim light, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Sam stumbled back, slamming the door shut. "We need to leave." "Now," he gasped, his voice trembling. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my pack and rushed toward the back of the cabin, where a small window offered our only escape route. Chris was already there, trying to pry it open, his hands shaking. The banging resumed, louder this time, more frantic. The door rattled on its hinges as whatever was outside began to claw at it, a grating, splintering sound that set my teeth on edge. "Hurry!" I urged, my eyes darting to the door. It bulged inward, wood cracking under the strain. Finally, the window gave way, and Chris climbed through, dropping to the ground outside. "Come on!" he called, waving us toward him. Sam went next, squeezing through the narrow opening with a grunt. I was last, my heart pounding as I hoisted myself up and over the ledge. I landed hard on the ground outside, the cold earth jarring my bones. I scrambled to my feet, glancing back at the cabin just as the door crashed open. In the dim light spilling from the window, I saw it, A hulking figure, its body twisted and covered in matted fur. It moved awkwardly, its limbs too long, its head lolling to one side. For a moment, it just stood there, staring at us with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. "Run!" Sam shouted, and we took off, sprinting into the forest with no clear direction. The trees blurred past, branches whipping at my face as I pushed forward, the sound of heavy footsteps crashing behind us. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, every breath a ragged gasp as we raced through the underbrush. I could hear it following, its movements erratic, like it was crashing through the forest with no regard for the obstacles in its path. "Over here!" Chris yelled, veering sharply to the right. I followed, my legs screaming in protest as we scrambled up a slope. My foot slipped on a patch of loose dirt, and I nearly fell, catching myself on a branch at the last second. We broke through the tree line and stumbled onto the trail, gasping for breath. I chanced to look back, my eyes scanning the darkness. Nothing. The forest was silent again, the cabin hidden somewhere in the shadows behind us. "Keep moving," Sam panted, grabbing my arm. "We need to get as far away as possible." We didn't stop running until we reached the clearing where we'd parked the car. We threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut, and I started the engine with shaking hands. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the trail in front of us. I floored the gas pedal, tearing down the dirt road, the trees flying past in a blur. None of us spoke, too terrified to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we were miles away, the cabin a distant memory, that I finally dared to breathe. What was that thing?" Chris whispered, his voice hollow. "I don't know," I muttered, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. "But we're not going back to find out." In the rearview mirror, the darkness of the forest seemed to shift, as if something was watching us leave. I swallowed hard, my heart still pounding. The image of that twisted figure burned into my mind. The forest had changed that night. And now, no matter how far I go, I know that some places, like that cabin on the ridge, are best left undisturbed. Story 21. The woods come alive at night, but not always in ways that make sense. The stories people tell about the things that lurk out there, the creatures and shadows that shouldn't exist, have a way of creeping into your mind when you're alone on those winding roads. I never put much stock in legends or tales, not until that night when I found myself driving through the forest under a full moon, and it crossed the road. It was supposed to be just another night shift. As a forest ranger, late patrols were part of the job, especially on remote, forgotten roads that cut through the deepest parts of the woods. I was the only ranger on duty that night, tasked with a sweep of the southern sector. A simple drive, in and out, no problems. The full moon hung high, bathing the forest in a pale, almost eerie light that filtered through the trees and danced along the road. I'd been on the road for about an hour, my truck's headlights cutting through the darkness ahead of me. The hum of the engine and the occasional crunch of gravel under the tires were the only sounds breaking the silence. I wasn't expecting much tonight, maybe a stray deer or two at most. I turned a corner, my eyes catching movement in the tree line to my right. I slowed down, thinking it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but something about the way the shadows moved made my skin prickle. I squinted, scanning the underbrush, but all I saw was darkness and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. "Just nerves," I muttered to myself, shaking off the unease. Nights in the forest could do that to you, make your imagination run wild. I pressed on, keeping my speed steady as the road straightened out, stretching into a long, narrow tunnel of trees. Then it happened. It came out of nowhere, darting across the road, just a few yards in front of my truck. My foot slammed on the brake instinctively, and the tires screeched against the gravel, sending the truck skidding to a halt. My heart thudded against my ribs as I gripped the wheel, eyes wide and locked on the spot where it had crossed. "What the hell was that?" I gasped, my breath fogging up the inside of the windshield. The headlights illuminated nothing but the empty road and the tree line beyond, now eerily still, But I had seen something. It was too big, too fast to be any animal I knew. My pulse quickened as I scanned the forest edge, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for movement, and then I saw it. Just beyond the road, half hidden among the trees, it stood there. My heart skipped a beat. The creature was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in thick, matted fur that seemed almost black under the moonlight. It stood on 2 legs, its posture hunched and predatory, like a wolf poised to pounce. But it wasn't a wolf. It couldn't be. Its eyes caught the light from the headlights, glowing a sickly yellow, fixed directly on me. I felt a wave of terror crash over me, pinning me to my seat. I couldn't look away. It stared at me with an intensity that chilled me to my core, its lips curling back to reveal sharp, gleaming teeth. It almost looked amused, like it knew exactly what it was doing, how it was making me feel. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I forced myself to blink, to break eye contact, and reach for the radio. My fingers fumbled with the button as I kept glancing up, half expecting the creature to charge at the truck at any second. "Base, this is Ranger Malcolm," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm on Route 14, about 3 miles from the south lookout point. I've got a situation out here." Static crackled from the radio, followed by a garbled voice. "Copy, Ranger Malcolm. What's your situation?" I swallowed hard, trying to find the words. "There's something out here. I don't know what it is, but it's—" I stopped, my eyes darting back to the tree line. The creature was gone. My heart leaped into my throat as I scanned the area, but all I saw were shadows and the swaying branches. "Ranger Malcolm, do you copy?" The voice crackled through the radio, pulling me back. It crossed the road in front of me," I stammered, still searching the darkness. "Big, 2-legged, like a wolf, but standing upright." Silence filled the truck, and I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow. The radio hissed before the voice came back, now tinged with concern. "Stay in your vehicle, Malcolm. We're sending backup. ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. My eyes flicked to the clock on the dashboard. I wasn't sure I had 20 minutes. I felt exposed, like a sitting duck out there on the road, and I fought the urge to put the truck in gear and floor it back to the station. But then I saw movement again. My grip tightened on the wheel as the creature emerged from the tree line, stepping into the edge of the headlight's glow. It moved slowly, deliberately, each step impossibly quiet for something of its size. I could see it more clearly now. Its fur was patchy in places, revealing pale, leathery skin beneath. Its limbs were too long, its fingers ending in sharp, curved claws that glinted in the light. It paused, standing there in the middle of the road, its head tilting slightly as it regarded the truck. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, so deep I felt it vibrate in my chest. I swallowed, trying to stay calm, to think. The truck's engine was still running, the headlights casting a stark beam that seemed to only heighten the creature's presence. It took a step forward, then another, its eyes never leaving mine. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I reached for the gear shift, my movements slow, deliberate, not wanting to provoke it. As my hand touched the shifter, the creature froze, its eyes narrowing, teeth bared in a snarl. I hesitated, my breath hitching in my throat. It was watching my every move, calculating, waiting. I had to make a decision, and I had to make it now. I took a deep breath and shifted the truck into reverse. The vehicle lurched backward, the headlights swinging to the side, casting the creature into darkness. I glanced in the rearview mirror, guiding the truck slowly down the road. My eyes flicked back to the windshield, but the creature was gone, swallowed by the shadows. For a split second I thought I might have lost it. I kept backing up, my heart pounding, my hands shaking on the wheel. Then a blur of motion to my left made me snap my head around. It was running alongside the truck, its form gliding through the forest with a speed and agility that made my blood turn to ice. "Jesus Christ," I muttered, gripping the wheel and steering the truck back onto the road. I floored the gas. the tires spinning for a moment before gripping the gravel and propelling the vehicle forward. The creature kept pace, its shape a dark shadow moving through the trees just beyond the road's edge. I pushed the truck harder, the engine roaring as I accelerated. The road twisted and turned, the headlights bouncing over the terrain, casting wild shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. I glanced out the side window, and for a horrifying second, I saw it clearly, running on all fours now. Its eyes locked onto me, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It veered closer, and I swerved, the truck skidding slightly on the loose gravel. "Come on, come on!" I growled through gritted teeth, urging the vehicle forward. The road straightened out, and I pressed the pedal to the floor, the speedometer climbing as the engine roared. I couldn't look away from the road, couldn't risk seeing if it was still beside me. After what felt like an eternity, the road widened, leading into a clearing where the backup rangers would be arriving soon. I finally dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The forest behind me was dark, the road empty. It was gone. I didn't stop until I reached the clearing, my hands trembling as I killed the engine and jumped out of the truck. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, staring back down the road. There was no sign of the creature, no movement in the shadows. Minutes later, the headlights of another ranger truck appeared, and I let out a shaky breath. The backup had arrived. But as they pulled up beside me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, somewhere in the forest, watching. "What happened, Malcolm?" one of the rangers asked, concern etched on his face. I swallowed, trying to steady my voice. "It crossed the road, something big, and it followed me." The ranger exchanged a glance with his partner, then looked back at me. "You did the right thing. Getting out of there," he said. "We'll investigate in the morning." I nodded, though I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever that creature was, it didn't leave traces. It was part of the forest, part of the darkness, and it had let me go. This time, I climbed back into my truck, my hands still shaking. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. But the road remained empty, bathed in the cold, indifferent light of the moon.